Welcome to my latest video. This is an audiobook story, and any names used or depicted in this story is not based on real people. So leave a like, subscribe and leave a notification bell on. Thank and enjoy the story. For Jacob Torres, however, it felt like a different world entirely. He stood at the edge of the town square, watching as Owen bargained with a blacksmith over a gleaming sword. Lyra and Ella were a short distance away, inspecting a map spread out on a wooden table. It had been weeks since the confrontation in the forest. Weeks since they had narrowly escaped the hooded man and the revelation of the catalyst's true purpose. The group had managed to evade pursuit and find a moment of calm here in Havenridge, but Jacob knew it wouldn't last. The relic hung in a pouch at his side, its hum a faint but constant reminder of the power it held, and the danger it brought. Jacob had tried to focus on the here and now, on restocking supplies and planning their next move, but his thoughts kept drifting to what lay ahead. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," Lyra said, appearing beside him. She handed him a small apple, her sharp eyes scanning the bustling square. "Which, I guess, isn't far from the truth." Jacob managed a weak smile. "Just thinking about what's next. Nalia said we needed to find the other pieces of the artifact, but we don't even know where to start." Lyra shrugged, her expression unreadable. "We've managed so far, and we're not alone in this." "You're not alone in this." He nodded, her words comforting even as the weight of responsibility lingered. The catalyst's power was growing stronger, its presence more insistent with each passing day. He could feel it pulling him toward something, though he didn't know what. "Jacob," Owen called, waving from across the square. "Come check this out." Jacob and Lyra exchanged a glance before weaving through the crowd toward him. The blacksmith had disappeared, but in his place stood an older woman wrapped in a dark cloak. Her face was partially hidden by a hood, but her piercing blue eyes locked onto Jacob the moment he approached. "Your friend says you're looking for something," the woman said, her voice low and gravelly. "Something ancient." Jacob's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" The woman's lips curled into a thin smile. "A friend, perhaps, or a guide, if you'll let me be. But you must decide quickly. Time is not on your side." "What do you know about the catalyst?" Lyra asked, her tone sharp. The woman's eyes flickered to Lyra, then back to Jacob. "More than you do, I imagine. Enough to know that if you don't find the next piece soon, it may be too late." Jacob's chest tightened. "What do you mean? Too late for what?" "For the world you know," the woman replied, her voice tinged with urgency. "The darkness you've encountered is only the beginning. The catalyst's power is awakening, and it's drawing others to it, others who seek to claim it for their own purposes." "Why should we trust you?" Owen asked, crossing his arms. The woman reached into her cloak and pulled out a small, weathered scroll. She handed it to Jacob, who unrolled it carefully. The parchment was covered in symbols and a crude map, with 3 points marked in red ink. One of them was labeled the catalyst. "This map will lead you to the next piece," the woman said. "But be warned. The path is dangerous, and the artifact is guarded. You'll need more than courage to retrieve it." Jacob studied the map, his mind racing. The second point was located deep within a mountain range far to the north. The third was even farther, near the coast of a distant land. "Why are you helping us?" Jacob asked, narrowing his eyes. The woman's smile faded, replaced by a somber expression. "Because I've seen what happens if you fail. The darkness you face isn't just an enemy. It's a force that will consume everything if left unchecked. I'm helping you because I believe you might succeed where others have not." Before Jacob could respond, the woman turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving them with more questions than answers. "She seems trustworthy," Owen muttered sarcastically. "She knows more than she's letting on," Lyra said, her eyes still scanning the crowd. "But she's not wrong. We don't have time to waste." Jacob nodded, clutching the map tightly. The weight of their mission pressed down on him, heavier than ever. The path ahead was uncertain, but there was no turning back now. "Let's get what we need and head north," Jacob said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "If this map is real, the next piece of the artifact is waiting for us." As they made their way out of the square, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The catalyst's hum grew louder, its energy pulsing in time with his racing heart. The journey was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. Chapter 2. A long road ahead. The morning sun crept over the hills as the group set out from Havenridge, the weight of the mysterious woman's warning lingering in the air. The forest behind them was a distant memory, but the dangers ahead loomed larger with every step. Jacob walked at the head of the group, the scroll tucked securely in his pack. His mind raced as he replayed the woman's words. The map pointed north, toward the jagged peaks of the Ironclaw Mountains. Somewhere within lay the next piece of the artifact. This map better not lead us into another trap, Owen muttered from behind, adjusting the straps of his gear. I'm still sore from the last adventure. Do you ever stop complaining? Lyra asked, rolling her eyes. I'm just saying, Owen shot back. We don't know anything about this woman. For all we know, she's working for the hooded guy. She seemed genuine, Jacob said, though he wasn't entirely convinced. And if she's right, we don't have much choice. The catalyst is leading us somewhere, and we need to find out why. Ella, who had been quiet most of the morning, finally spoke up. I don't trust her either, but the map does line up with what Nalia told us. The artifact pieces are out there, and someone, or something, is already looking for them. The group fell silent, their footsteps crunching on the dirt path. As they walked, the landscape began to change. The rolling hills gave way to rocky terrain, and the air grew colder with each passing hour. By midday, they reached a narrow canyon. The cliffs rose steeply on either side, casting long shadows across the path. This feels like a bad idea, Owen said, eyeing the cliffs warily. Agreed, Lyra said, drawing her dagger. It's the perfect place for an ambush. Jacob tightened his grip on the relic's pouch, the hum growing faintly louder as if sensing danger. Stay close, he said. We'll move quickly. They entered the canyon, their movements cautious and deliberate. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the air grew still. Every sound, a falling pebble, the rustle of wind, felt amplified. Halfway through, Jacob felt it, a sharp, cold presence, like the air itself was alive. He stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. Something's here, he whispered. Before anyone could respond, a shadow moved at the edge of his vision. Then another. Shapes darted along the cliffs above, too fast to track. Get ready, Lyra shouted, drawing her bow. The first attack came without warning. A hail of arrows rained down from the cliffs, forcing the group to dive for cover. Jacob rolled behind a boulder, his heart pounding. Bandits, Owen yelled, deflecting an arrow with his shield. The attackers leapt from the cliffs, landing with unnerving precision. They were clad in dark leather armor, their faces obscured by masks. Give us the relic, and we might let you live, one of them sneered, stepping forward with a curved blade in hand. Jacob's grip tightened on the catalyst. Not a chance. The bandit leader laughed, signaling his men to attack. Chaos erupted as the group fought back. Lyra's arrows flew with deadly accuracy, taking down two bandits before they reached the ground. Owen charged forward, his shield a battering ram as he knocked another aside. Ella muttered an incantation, her hands glowing with arcane energy. A blast of fire erupted from her palms, scattering the attackers. Jacob, clutching the relic, felt its power surge through him. The hum became a roar, and his vision blurred. Instinctively, he raised his free hand, and a wave of energy burst forth, sending several bandits flying. The leader's eyes widened. He has it. Take him down. Two bandits rushed at Jacob, but before they could reach him, Lyra appeared at his side, her dagger flashing in the sunlight. Stay focused, she shouted, knocking one of them to the ground. The fight was brutal but quick. One by one, the bandits fell or retreated, until only the leader remained. He glared at Jacob, his blade trembling in his hand. This isn't over, he growled before throwing a smoke bomb to the ground. When the smoke cleared, he was gone. Jacob lowered his hand, the energy from the catalyst fading. His body trembled with exhaustion. You okay? Ella asked, stepping to his side. I'm fine, Jacob said, though his voice was shaky. What was that? How did they know about the relic? They must have been watching us, Lyra said, wiping blood from her blade. But they didn't seem like ordinary bandits. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Owen kicked a discarded weapon, his expression grim. We can't keep this thing a secret forever. People are going to come for it, and for us. Jacob nodded, the weight of their mission heavier than ever. The catalyst was more than just a relic. It was a beacon, drawing everyone and everything toward it. We need to move, he said, adjusting his pack. If the map's right, we're still a day's journey from the mountains. And if this is what we're up against now, we need to be ready for worse. The group gathered their gear and pressed on, leaving the canyon behind. The battle had shaken them, but their resolve was stronger than ever. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Ironclaw Mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks silhouetted against the twilight sky. The journey was only beginning, and Jacob knew the challenges ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Dark. Nightfall brought a chilling wind as the group set up camp at the base of the Ironclaw Mountains. A small fire crackled at the center of their clearing, casting flickering shadows against the towering peaks. Jacob sat near the flames, the catalyst resting in his lap. Its hum was subdued now, but he could still feel its presence, like a distant pulse in the back of his mind. We should take turns keeping watch, Lyra said, sharpening her dagger. If those bandits could find us in the canyon, who's to say others won't? I'll take first watch, Owen offered, sitting cross-legged with his sword resting on his knee. I've got a bad feeling about this place. Ella glanced up from her spellbook, her brow furrowed. I don't sense anything specific, but the air here, it feels off. Like something is watching. Jacob didn't respond. He was focused on the catalyst, running his fingers over its strange, engraved surface. The relic seemed almost alive, its intricate patterns shifting slightly under the firelight. Jacob, Lyra said, snapping him out of his trance. You okay? He looked up, startled. Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking. More like brooding, Owen muttered. Jacob ignored the jab and stood, slipping the catalyst back into its pouch. I'll take second watch, he said, stepping away from the fire. The night deepened, the stars obscured by thick clouds that rolled in from the north. Owen's watch passed uneventfully, and soon it was Jacob's turn. He sat near the fire, his eyes scanning the shadows that crept along the mountain's base. The world was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the sparse trees. The fire's warmth barely cut through the biting cold, and Jacob found himself tightening his cloak around him. It wasn't long before the silence was broken. At first, it was faint, a whispering sound carried on the wind. Jacob frowned, leaning forward to listen. The whispers grew louder, forming words he couldn't quite understand. Hello, he called softly, gripping the hilt of his dagger. The whispers stopped abruptly. The stillness that followed was even more unsettling. Jacob stood, his gaze darting around the camp. The others were asleep, their breaths steady and undisturbed. He took a cautious step toward the edge of the clearing, his heart pounding. Then he saw it. A faint light in the distance, glowing a soft, unnatural blue. It flickered like a flame but didn't seem attached to any source. Compelled by a strange pull, Jacob moved toward the light. Each step felt heavier, as though the earth itself was trying to hold him back. Jacob. He froze. The voice was soft but unmistakable, calling his name from somewhere ahead. Who's there? He demanded, his voice shaking. The light pulsed, and the voice came again, clearer this time. Come closer. Jacob hesitated. Every instinct screamed for him to turn back, but the catalyst began to hum loudly, vibrating against his chest as if urging him forward. Against his better judgment, he stepped closer to the light. The glow grew brighter, revealing a figure standing in the shadows. It was a woman, her features obscured by a flowing cloak. Her eyes glowed the same blue as the light. Jacob Torres, she said, her voice calm but commanding. You carry the catalyst. Who are you? Jacob asked, gripping his dagger tightly. A messenger, the woman replied. From those who know the truth of what you hold. Jacob's throat tightened. What truth? The catalyst is more than a relic, she said, stepping closer. It is a key, to power, to knowledge, and to devastation. It was scattered long ago to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. But now, it is awakening. Jacob's grip on his dagger loosened slightly. What do you mean? Why is it awakening? The woman's glowing eyes narrowed. Because the world is breaking, Jacob. And with it comes the one who will wield the catalyst to reshape it. Whether that wielder brings salvation or ruin, that is up to you. Before Jacob could respond, the light around the woman flared, blinding him. He stumbled back, shielding his eyes. When the light faded, she was gone, leaving only the stillness of the night. The whispers had stopped. The fire crackled faintly behind him, and the camp was as quiet as it had been before. Jacob returned to his spot by the fire, his mind racing. The woman's words echoed in his ears. The catalyst was a key, but to what? And what did she mean by, reshape the world? Sleep eluded him for the rest of his watch. When dawn broke, he roused the others, keeping the encounter to himself for now. There was too much he didn't understand, and the answers would have to wait. As the group packed up camp and began their climb into the mountains, Jacob felt the catalysts hum more strongly than ever. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: their journey was no longer just about survival. It was about something far greater, and far more dangerous. Chapter 4. Into the Mountains. The Ironclaw Mountains loomed overhead, jagged peaks that seemed to pierce the clouds. The climb was steep, and the air grew thinner with every step. The group trudged along the narrow path, the crunch of their boots on loose gravel the only sound breaking the silence. Whoever hid this artifact sure went out of their way to make it impossible to find, Owen grumbled, steadying himself on a rocky outcrop. Better for us, Lyra replied, scanning the cliffs above. If it's hard for us to reach, it's hard for anyone else too. Ella, walking beside Jacob, shivered despite her thick cloak. The magic here is strange, she said quietly. It feels twisted, like the mountain itself is alive. Jacob nodded but didn't respond. The memory of the glowing woman and her cryptic words weighed heavily on his mind. He hadn't told the others yet, unsure of how they'd react. The catalyst pulsed faintly in his pack, a constant reminder of its presence. The group pressed on until they reached a flat ledge overlooking a sheer drop. Far below, the forest stretched out like a dark sea. A gust of wind howled through the cliffs, carrying with it a faint, eerie whistling sound. We should stop here for a moment, Lyra suggested, kneeling to examine the map. The next part of the path gets even steeper. We need to make sure we're heading the right way. While Lyra and Ella studied the map, Owen wandered to the edge of the cliff, peering down. Do you think anyone's ever fallen from up here? He asked, more to himself than anyone else. Don't test that theory, Lyra said without looking up. Jacob sat on a nearby rock, his gaze fixed on the mountains ahead. Somewhere up there was the next piece of the artifact, hidden in a place few dared to venture. Jacob, he turned to see Lyra motioning him over. Take a look at this, she said, pointing to the map. Jacob crouched beside her. The map showed their current location marked with a faint X. Further up the mountain was a winding path that led to a small symbol, a crescent moon surrounded by jagged lines. This is where the map is leading us, Lyra explained. It's called the Shardspire Cavern. Ever heard of it? Jacob shook his head. What's inside? No one knows for sure, Ella said, tracing the symbol with her finger. Some say it's a sanctuary. Others say it's cursed. Either way, it's where we're going. Owen returned to the group, crossing his arms. Great. A cursed cavern in the middle of nowhere. What could possibly go wrong? Plenty, Lyra said dryly, folding the map. Let's keep moving. We're losing daylight. The climb grew more treacherous as they ascended. The path narrowed, forcing them to walk single file, and loose rocks tumbled down the cliffs with every misstep. As they rounded a bend, a strange sound reached their ears, a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from the cliffs above. Tell me that was the wind, Owen said, his voice tense. It wasn't, Lyra replied, drawing her bow. Jacob's hand instinctively went to the catalyst. The hum grew stronger, as if the relic was reacting to whatever was out there. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against stone. Something's coming, Ella said, her hands already glowing with magical energy. The group froze, their eyes scanning the cliffs. Moments later, a massive shadow appeared, leaping down from a ledge above. It was a creature unlike anything they'd seen before, part wolf, part reptile, with scales that shimmered like obsidian. Its eyes glowed a menacing red, and its claws looked sharp enough to cut through steel. Run or fight? Owen asked, raising his shield. "Fight," Lyra said, loosing an arrow. The shot struck the creature's shoulder, but it barely flinched, turning its glowing eyes toward her. Jacob unsheathed his dagger, the catalyst thrumming in his pack. The creature lunged, its claws striking the ground where Lyra had stood moments before. Ella unleashed a bolt of fire, hitting the creature square in the chest. It howled in pain but quickly recovered, charging toward her. Jacob darted forward, his instincts taking over. He reached into his pack, pulling out the catalyst. The relic's energy surged through him, and he raised his hand, releasing a wave of force that knocked the creature back. The group didn't waste the opportunity. Lyra fired another arrow, this time hitting its neck. Owen rushed in, delivering a powerful blow with his sword. The creature staggered, its movements growing sluggish. Finally, with one last strike from Owen, it collapsed to the ground, motionless. Jacob lowered the catalyst, his body trembling from the effort. "What was that thing?" Lyra asked, panting. "No idea," Owen said, nudging the creature with his boot. "But I hope we don't run into another one." Ella examined the creature's body, her expression grim. "It wasn't natural," she said. The magic around it felt corrupted. Like it was created, not born. Jacob exchanged a glance with Lyra. "Someone, or something, is trying to stop us," he said. "Then we'd better move fast," Lyra replied. "The cavern isn't far now." The group pressed on, their nerves on edge. The encounter with the creature had shaken them, but it also solidified their resolve. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they finally reached the entrance to the Shardspire cavern. The massive stone archway was carved with strange symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the fading light. "This is it," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob stepped forward, the catalyst humming louder than ever. Whatever lay inside, he knew it would bring them one step closer to understanding the relic's true purpose, and the danger it carried with it. With a deep breath, he led the group into the darkness of the cavern. Chapter 5. The Shardspire Cavern. The air inside the Shardspire cavern was damp and heavy, carrying the faint metallic tang of stone long undisturbed. The walls glittered faintly with mineral deposits, reflecting the dim light of Ella's glowing spell orb. The faint hum of the catalyst seemed amplified in the cavern's oppressive silence, vibrating against Jacob's chest like a heartbeat. "This place gives me the creeps," Owen muttered, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. He gripped his sword tightly, his eyes darting to every shadow. "Stay alert," Lyra said, her bow ready in hand. "If that thing outside was just a guard, who knows what's in here?" Ella stopped to examine the symbols carved into the walls, running her fingers over the intricate designs. "These glyphs, they're ancient," she murmured. "Older than anything I've studied. And look here," she pointed to one symbol, a spiral surrounded by jagged lines. "It matches the symbol on the map. Which means we're in the right place," Lyra said. Jacob nodded, stepping further into the cavern. The catalyst's hum grew stronger with every step, almost as if it was guiding him. The group moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing through the cavern's winding tunnels. Strange sounds accompanied them, distant drips of water, the occasional rumble of shifting stone, and faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. "Did you hear that?" Owen asked, freezing mid-step. "Hear what?" Lyra replied, scanning the darkness ahead. "Voices," he said, his brow furrowed. "Like someone's whispering." Ella exchanged a glance with Jacob. "It's the magic in this place. It's alive, in a way." "Great," Owen grumbled. "Living magic. That's comforting." The group pressed on until they reached a large chamber. At its center stood a massive stone pedestal, shaped like a jagged spire. The top of the spire was flat, and resting on it was a crystalline shard that glowed faintly with a pale blue light. "That must be it," Lyra said, her voice hushed. Jacob stepped forward, the catalyst practically vibrating in his hand. As he approached the pedestal, the shard's glow intensified, illuminating the chamber with an otherworldly light. "Careful," Ella warned. "There's no way it's unprotected." Jacob hesitated, reaching out toward the shard. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, the entire cavern shook violently. Dust and small stones rained down from above, and the pedestal's glow flared. "What did you do?" Owen shouted, steadying himself against a wall. Before Jacob could answer, the walls around them began to shift, the glyphs glowing brighter and pulsing in time with the shard's light. "Something's coming," Lyra said, knocking an arrow. The ground beneath the pedestal split open with a deafening crack, and from the depths emerged a massive, serpentine creature. Its body was covered in gleaming black scales, and its eyes burned with the same blue light as the shard. "A guardian," Ella said, her voice trembling. The serpent reared back, letting out an ear-splitting roar that echoed through the cavern. Jacob gripped the catalyst tightly, feeling its energy surge through him. The creature struck first, its massive tail sweeping across the chamber. The group scattered, narrowly avoiding the blow. Lyra fired an arrow, but it bounced harmlessly off the serpent's scales. "We can't hurt it," she shouted. "There has to be a way." Jacob yelled back, dodging another strike from the creature. Ella unleashed a blast of fire, but the serpent absorbed it, its scales glowing brighter. "Magic only makes it stronger," she said, panic in her voice. Jacob's mind raced. The catalyst was still thrumming, its energy practically begging to be released. He looked at the shard, then back at the serpent. "It's connected to the shard," he realized. "We need to break it." "How?" Owen shouted, barely deflecting a blow from the serpent's tail with his shield. "Keep it distracted," Jacob called, sprinting toward the pedestal. The serpent roared, turning its attention to Jacob. Lyra and Owen moved quickly, drawing its focus with arrows and sword strikes. Ella cast an illusion spell, creating shimmering duplicates of herself that confused the creature momentarily. Reaching the pedestal, Jacob held the catalyst aloft. Its energy surged, a blinding light emanating from the relic. He slammed it against the shard, the impact sending a shockwave through the cavern. The shard cracked, and the serpent let out a piercing screech. Its body convulsed, its glowing eyes dimming as the shard fractured further. "Keep going," Lyra shouted. Jacob struck the shard again, this time shattering it completely. The serpent let out one final, agonized roar before collapsing into a heap of lifeless scales. The cavern fell silent, the oppressive energy dissipating. Breathing heavily, Jacob stepped back, the catalyst's glow fading. "Is it over?" Owen asked, lowering his sword. "For now," Lyra said, though her expression remained wary. Ella approached the shattered remains of the shard, picking up a small fragment. "This magic. It's unlike anything I've ever seen. Whoever created this guardian wanted to make sure no one could reach the shard." Jacob looked down at the catalyst, its surface now etched with faint, glowing lines that hadn't been there before. "The catalyst absorbed some of its power," he said, his voice uncertain. Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we'd better figure out what that means, fast." The group gathered their gear and prepared to leave the cavern. As they stepped out into the cold mountain air, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, the rest of the artifact awaited. And with it, more dangers he couldn't yet imagine. Chapter 6. Ripples in the Dark. The descent from the Shardspire cavern was marked by a heavy silence. Jacob felt the catalyst pulsing faintly against his side, a reminder of the shard's fragmented power now residing within it. He kept his eyes on the rocky trail ahead, but his mind churned with questions. "Do you feel that?" Ella broke the silence, her voice tinged with unease. "Feel what?" Owen asked, his tone guarded. "The magic," Ella replied. "It's like the air itself is heavier now, even outside the cavern." Lyra nodded, scanning their surroundings. "She's right. Whatever we disrupted back there has sent shockwaves through the area. We need to stay on guard." Jacob slowed his pace, looking down at the catalyst in his hand. Its surface shimmered faintly, the new etchings glimmering like veins of molten metal. He clenched his fist around it, unwilling to voice the nagging thought that had taken root in his mind. The shard's destruction had awakened something. As the group rounded a bend, the forest below came into view. But what had been a serene sea of green when they first ascended was now shrouded in an unnatural mist. "That's not normal," Owen said, gripping his sword. Ella raised her hand, letting a small orb of light float out in front of her. The mist recoiled slightly, as if reluctant to touch the magical energy. "We need to get through this quickly," Lyra said, notching an arrow and keeping it ready. "Stay close." The group descended into the fog, the forest eerily quiet. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled, only the sound of their footsteps broke the oppressive stillness. "This place feels," Wrong, Owen muttered, his knuckles white around his sword hilt. Jacob felt it too. The catalyst's hum grew stronger, as if it was reacting to something nearby. He stopped suddenly, causing the group to halt. Jacob, Lyra asked, her voice tense. There's something out there, he said, his eyes scanning the mist. The group instinctively formed a defensive circle, weapons and spells at the ready. Moments later, faint whispers began to echo through the fog. You hear that, right? Owen asked, his voice low. I hear it, Ella confirmed, her glowing orb flaring brighter. The whispers grew louder, forming words that sent chills down Jacob's spine. You shouldn't have come here. Show yourself, Lyra shouted, her arrow aimed into the mist. The fog shifted, coalescing into shadowy figures that flickered like candle flames. They surrounded the group, their forms indistinct but menacing. What are they? Owen asked, his shield raised. Manifestations, Ella said, her voice shaking. The mist must be magical, drawing on our fears and doubts. The figures closed in, their whispers growing deafening. You'll never succeed. You're not strong enough. You'll only bring ruin. Jacob gritted his teeth, the catalyst burning hot in his hand. The voices clawed at his mind, feeding on his insecurities. He could feel the weight of their words, the doubts they planted. What if I fail? What if I can't control this power? No, he muttered, his grip tightening on the catalyst. The relic pulsed, its light cutting through the fog like a beacon. You're wrong. He raised the catalyst, releasing a wave of energy that blasted the figures back. The whispers faded, replaced by an angry hiss as the shadows dissolved into the mist. The group stood in stunned silence, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. Well, that was fun, Owen said, though his voice was shaky. Ella placed a hand on Jacob's arm. How did you do that? I don't know, Jacob admitted, lowering the catalyst. It just felt right. Lyra stepped forward, her gaze sharp. Whatever this mist is, it's trying to wear us down. We need to move fast before it gets worse. The group pressed on, the fog gradually thinning as they descended further. But the unease lingered, a constant reminder of the unseen forces at work. By the time they reached the forest floor, the mist had all but disappeared. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trees. We should set up camp, Lyra said. We've had enough excitement for one day. The group found a small clearing and began to unpack their supplies. Owen started a fire while Lyra set up a perimeter of traps. Ella sat cross-legged, studying the shard fragment she had taken from the cavern. Jacob moved to the edge of the clearing, staring out at the darkening forest. The catalyst felt heavier than before, its power a constant presence in his mind. He knew the journey ahead would only get harder, but the questions still gnawed at him. Who had created the shards? And what would happen when they were all found? As the first stars appeared in the sky, Jacob made a silent vow. No matter what lay ahead, he would uncover the truth about the catalyst, even if it meant facing the darkness that had begun to stir in its wake. Chapter 7. Shadows in the Night. The campfire crackled softly, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows across the clearing. The group sat in a loose circle, exhaustion evident in their slouched postures. Despite the warmth of the fire, the chill of the day's events lingered, unshaken by their brief respite. Owen leaned back against a tree, polishing his sword with deliberate strokes. I'm just saying, he began, breaking the silence, it might be nice to go on a trip where we're not constantly getting attacked by something. I didn't hear you complaining when we fought off that wyvern last month, Lyra retorted, smirking. That was different. That wyvern had gold, Owen shot back, holding up a finger. This mist, shadows whispering creepy stuff, no thanks. Ella chuckled softly, though her eyes remained fixed on the shard fragment in her hands. You'll have to get used to it. The closer we get to finding all the shards, the more resistance we'll face. Speaking of which, Lyra said, turning to Jacob, do you have any idea what's going on with that catalyst of yours? It's changing. Jacob looked down at the relic resting beside him. The faint etchings that had appeared in the cavern now seemed to shift, as if alive. He picked it up, the surface warm to the touch, and shook his head. It feels stronger, like it's absorbing energy. But I don't know what that means, or what it's doing to me. Ella glanced up, her expression serious. The catalyst is linked to the shards. If it's absorbing their energy, it's possible it's also unlocking new powers within you. But that kind of connection works both ways. You might be attracting attention. Great, Owen muttered. As if we didn't already have enough problems. Before anyone could respond, a faint rustling sound came from the edge of the clearing. Everyone froze, their hands instinctively going to their weapons. Did you hear that? Lyra whispered, her voice sharp. Owen rose to his feet, sword in hand. Probably just an animal, or something worse, Lyra countered, her bow drawn. The rustling grew louder, closer, until a figure emerged from the shadows. It was humanoid but unnervingly gaunt, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, and it moved with an unnatural, jerking gait. What is that? Owen asked, stepping back. A shade, Ella said grimly, standing and conjuring a flame in her palm. It's a creature of dark magic, drawn to powerful energy. Like the catalyst, Jacob realized, gripping it tightly. The shade let out a low, guttural hiss and lunged toward them. Lyra loosed an arrow, striking its shoulder, but the creature barely flinched. Not good, Owen said, raising his sword to block the shade's next strike. The impact sent him stumbling backward, the creature's strength far greater than it appeared. Ella hurled a fireball, hitting the shade square in the chest. It recoiled, but instead of disintegrating, it absorbed the flames, its glowing eyes burning brighter. Magic won't work on it, Ella shouted. Then we'll do it the old-fashioned way, Lyra said, darting in with her daggers. She slashed at the shade's legs, forcing it to stumble, but it lashed out with a clawed hand, narrowly missing her. Jacob felt the catalyst vibrate in his hand, its energy building rapidly. He stepped forward, holding it out like a shield. The shade's attention snapped to him immediately, its glowing eyes narrowing. Looks like it's drawn to you, Owen said, slashing at the creature to no avail. The catalyst's glow intensified, and Jacob felt a sudden rush of heat in his chest. Without thinking, he thrust the relic forward, unleashing a burst of light that struck the shade. The creature let out an ear-splitting shriek, its body convulsing as the light enveloped it. In moments, it disintegrated into a swirl of black smoke, which dissipated into the night. Jacob staggered back, his breathing heavy. The catalyst dimmed, its surface returning to its usual faint shimmer. Is everyone okay? He asked, his voice shaky. Define, okay, Owen said, lowering his sword. That thing nearly tore my arm off. What was that light? Lyra asked, staring at Jacob. I don't know, Jacob admitted, looking down at the catalyst. It just happened. Ella approached, her expression thoughtful. The catalyst's power is growing, but it's reacting instinctively. If we're going to face more shades, and I'm certain we will, you'll need to learn how to control it. And fast, Lyra added, scanning the forest. Where there's one shade, there are usually more. The group quickly broke camp, their earlier fatigue replaced by urgency. As they packed up and prepared to move, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the attack was more than a coincidence. The shard's destruction had awakened something ancient and powerful, and it wasn't going to let them go unchallenged. Whatever lay ahead, Jacob knew one thing for sure. The catalyst was both their greatest weapon, and their greatest danger. Chapter 8. The Hunter in the Shadows. The group moved quickly through the forest, the lingering unease of the shade's attack pressing them onward. The moonlight filtering through the canopy provided little comfort, casting eerie shadows that danced in their peripheral vision. We should have stayed and fought whatever's out here, Owen muttered, his grip on his sword tightening as his eyes darted around. No, we shouldn't have, Lyra said sharply. We're tired, we're outnumbered, and we're running on adrenaline. We wouldn't last against more shades. I agree, Ella added. We need to find a safe place to regroup and figure out our next move. Jacob kept silent, focusing on the catalyst in his hand. Its surface remained warm, but he could feel a faint tremor in its energy. It was as if the relic was warning him of something nearby, something worse than the shade. The forest grew denser as they pressed forward, the path narrowing and the trees towering overhead. The group's footsteps were muffled by the soft earth, but every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made them flinch. Then, without warning, Lyra raised a hand, signaling the group to stop. She knelt, her keen eyes scanning the ground. Tracks, she whispered. What kind? Owen asked, leaning over her shoulder. Not human, Lyra replied, her voice low. And fresh. Jacob's heart sank. Shades. Lyra shook her head, her expression grim. No, these are bigger. Something heavier. Before anyone could respond, a low growl echoed through the forest, freezing them in place. The sound was guttural, primal, and far too close for comfort. Okay, Owen said, gripping his sword. That's definitely not a shade. The growl came again, this time accompanied by the sound of snapping branches. Whatever was stalking them was closing in fast. Run, Lyra hissed, rising to her feet. The group took off, their earlier exhaustion forgotten in the face of raw fear. Jacob's lungs burned as he sprinted, the catalyst's heat increasing with every step. The growls grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of heavy footfalls crashing through the underbrush. It's gaining on us, Owen shouted, glancing back. Lyra veered sharply to the right. This way. The group followed her lead, weaving through the dense trees and leaping over roots and fallen branches. Jacob could feel the predator's presence closing in, its sheer size and speed sending vibrations through the ground. Just as it seemed the creature would overtake them, the forest opened up into a rocky ravine. A narrow bridge of stone spanned the chasm, the drop below disappearing into darkness. Cross it, now, Lyra yelled. Ella went first, her movements quick but steady. Jacob followed, gripping the catalyst tightly as he stepped onto the precarious bridge. The wind howled through the ravine, adding to the sense of danger. Behind him, Owen and Lyra brought up the rear, their eyes fixed on the edge of the forest. The growling had stopped, but the silence was even more unnerving. It's waiting, Lyra muttered, her eyes scanning the shadows. Just as she spoke, a massive figure emerged from the trees. It was a hulking beast, its body covered in matted fur and its eyes glowing a menacing red. Its claws scraped against the stone as it stepped forward, letting out a deafening roar that echoed through the ravine. What in the world is that? Owen shouted, his voice tinged with panic. A hunter, Ella said from the other side of the bridge. It's been tracking us since the cavern. The beast crouched, its muscles tensing as it prepared to leap onto the bridge. Get off the bridge, now, Lyra ordered. Jacob sprinted the remaining distance, his heart pounding as he reached the other side. Owen and Lyra weren't far behind, but the beast moved faster. It lunged onto the bridge, the stone cracking under its weight. The group turned to face the creature, weapons drawn. The beast roared again, its claws gouging deep marks into the bridge as it advanced. We can't fight that thing here, Owen shouted. We don't have a choice, Lyra said, notching an arrow and taking aim. Jacob stepped forward, the catalyst glowing brightly in his hand. He could feel its energy building, responding to the beast's presence. Maybe we do, he said, his voice steady despite his fear. The beast lunged, and Jacob raised the catalyst. A wave of energy erupted from the relic, slamming into the creature and halting its charge. The force cracked the bridge further, and the beast roared in fury, its claws scrabbling for purchase. It's not enough, Ella shouted, conjuring a shield of light to protect the group as the beast recovered. Jacob felt the catalyst pulse again, the heat in his hand becoming almost unbearable. He closed his eyes, focusing on the relic's power. He didn't fully understand it, but he knew he had to trust it. The catalyst flared, and another burst of energy shot out, this time splitting the bridge beneath the beast. With a deafening roar, the creature plummeted into the ravine, its form swallowed by the darkness below. The group stood in stunned silence, the only sound the distant rumble of falling rocks. Is it gone? Owen asked, peering over the edge. For now, Lyra said, lowering her bow. Jacob sank to his knees, the catalyst dimming as the adrenaline faded. He felt drained, as if the relic had pulled energy directly from him. Ella knelt beside him, her expression filled with concern. You're pushing yourself too hard. The catalyst's power isn't infinite. It takes a toll. I didn't have a choice, Jacob said, his voice weak. You made the right call, Lyra said, helping him to his feet. But we need to keep moving. That thing might not be the only hunter out here. The group resumed their journey, their steps cautious and their nerves frayed. Jacob clutched the catalyst tightly, its weight a constant reminder of the growing dangers they faced. As the forest closed in around them once more, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of their trials. The shards' power was calling to something ancient and deadly, and it wasn't going to stop until it claimed them all. Chapter 9. Into the Heart of Darkness. The group continued their trek through the forest, the canopy above now thick with tangled branches that blocked out the remaining slivers of moonlight. The sense of danger hadn't faded. If anything, it had only intensified. Jacob could feel the weight of the catalyst growing heavier in his hand with every step. His earlier victory against the beast had come at a cost. He was exhausted, and the strange connection he felt to the relic was beginning to take its toll. Every pulse of energy seemed to drain something from him, leaving him feeling weaker and more disoriented with each passing hour. "We should have reached the ruins by now," Owen muttered, his voice edgy. "I swear, these woods keep stretching farther every time we take a step." "It's not just the forest," Lyra replied, her sharp eyes scanning their surroundings. "The energy in the air is changing. It feels thicker, more oppressive." Jacob nodded, his own senses on high alert. The air was stifling, and the ground beneath them seemed to pulse with a subtle rhythm, like a heartbeat from deep within the earth. The catalyst's glow had become more erratic, flickering and dimming in rhythm with the pulsing beneath their feet. Ella, walking alongside Jacob, glanced at him with concern. "How are you holding up?" Jacob didn't answer right away. Instead, he focused on the faint humming coming from the catalyst. "I don't know. It's like it's pulling me forward, but at the same time, I feel like it's draining me dry." "We can't turn back now," Lyra said, her tone firm. "The ruins are close. Once we get to them, we'll have the answers we need." Suddenly, a strange sound echoed from the distance, a low, rumbling growl that sent a chill down Jacob's spine. "Not again," Owen groaned, his hand instinctively reaching for his sword. "It's not the same growl," Lyra said, her voice tight. "This one is different." The growl echoed again, closer this time. It was deeper, more resonant, and filled with malice. It was almost as if the forest itself was alive and angry, warning them to turn back. And then the trees parted ahead, revealing the source of the sound. A creature emerged from the shadows, larger and more terrifying than anything they had faced before. It was a massive, hulking figure, its body a grotesque blend of man and beast, twisted by dark magic. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural, blood-red glow, and its claws scraped against the earth, each movement sending vibrations through the ground. "What in the gods' names is that?" Owen whispered, stepping back. "That," Ella said grimly, "is a ravager." "A ravager?" Jacob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "An ancient creature," Lyra explained, her eyes narrowing. "They were created in the deep forests, guardians of the ruins long before the shards were hidden away. They're drawn to the relics." Jacob's heart pounded as the ravager began to move toward them, its heavy steps shaking the ground. Its features were monstrous, with jagged horns protruding from its skull and a wide maw that dripped with saliva. The stench of decay and dark magic filled the air, making Jacob gag. "It's going to tear us apart," Owen said, his voice strained. "We need a plan." "We fight," Lyra said, her bow already in hand. "If we can't outsmart it, we'll have to overpower it. We don't have time for this," Jacob shouted, panic rising in his chest. He looked down at the catalyst, which was now glowing fiercely, its pulse matching the rapid beat of his heart. "Jacob, wait," Ella called out, but it was too late. With a sudden surge of energy, Jacob thrust the catalyst forward. The light that erupted from it was blinding, a flash that cut through the darkness and sent ripples of force through the air. The ravager staggered, momentarily disoriented by the blast. But as the light faded, the creature recovered quickly, its eyes narrowing with renewed fury. It let out a deafening roar, shaking the trees around them. "We're not going to stop it like this," Lyra shouted, releasing an arrow that pierced the ravager's shoulder. The creature howled in pain, but the wound healed almost instantly, as if the dark magic inside it was constantly regenerating its flesh. "It's immune to magic," Ella said, her face pale. "We have to fight it with physical force." The ravager lunged, its claws sweeping through the air with terrifying speed. Jacob barely dodged, his heart racing as the creature's claws raked the ground where he had been standing. "Owen, cover me," Lyra shouted, Owen charged forward, his sword held high, and struck at the Ravager's side. But the blow barely made a dent, and the creature spun around to face him, its glowing eyes fixed on the warrior. "This thing's too strong," Owen grunted, trying to backpedal. Jacob gritted his teeth, clutching the catalyst tightly as he watched the battle unfold. He could feel its power surging again, but he was too drained to focus it properly. His vision blurred, and he stumbled, struggling to stay on his feet. "Jacob," Ella called out, her voice laced with worry. With a surge of willpower, Jacob pushed through the exhaustion, focusing everything he had left into the catalyst. It wasn't just about fighting anymore, it was about survival. He stepped forward, raising the relic, and a wave of energy exploded outward, washing over the Ravager. This time, the creature screamed in agony, its form writhing in the light. The force of the blast shattered the earth beneath it, sending the Ravager crashing to the ground. But even as the light began to fade, Jacob saw the creature twitching, its form already beginning to heal. "Is this thing invincible?" Owen asked, his voice low and strained. "No," Jacob said, his voice weak but determined. "It's not invincible, but it will take everything we have to bring it down." The Ravager slowly rose to its feet, its rage building once more. The battle was far from over, and Jacob knew that the outcome was uncertain. But with the catalyst's power growing stronger, he was beginning to realize something he hadn't fully understood before. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a fight to control the dark power that had been unleashed, before it consumed them all. And as the Ravager roared again, charging at them with renewed fury, Jacob felt a new determination rise within him. They weren't going to stop until the ruins were found, and the final shards were claimed. They couldn't afford to lose now. Chapter 10. The Tides of Power. The Ravager's roar sent a wave of panic through the group, but Jacob felt something else rising inside him, a rush of adrenaline that was more than just fear. The catalyst was glowing brighter now, pulsing with an energy he couldn't quite control but felt in every fiber of his being. It was like an untapped well of power had opened, waiting for him to command it. "We can't keep it off us forever," Owen shouted, his sword raised in a defensive stance, eyes flicking to Lyra and Ella. "We need a strategy, fast." Lyra knocked another arrow, aiming for the Ravager's eyes, but before she could release it, the beast lunged, its claws slashing through the air with frightening speed. Owen met it head-on, his sword cutting through the air to intercept the creature's strike. The impact of their clash sent sparks flying, but the Ravager's claws still landed with a deafening crash, sending Owen flying backward into a nearby tree. "Owen!" Ella cried, rushing to his side, but the Ravager was already moving again, its twisted, jagged form too quick and relentless to allow them a moment to breathe. Jacob didn't know how much longer he could hold out. The catalyst was almost burning his hand now, its energy vibrating through his body in a way that made his limbs feel heavy and his vision blur. He was losing control. The force of the magic was too much, too fast. But as the Ravager charged once more, something snapped inside him. Without thinking, he raised the catalyst higher, instinctively calling upon its power as if it were an extension of himself. A blast of energy erupted from the relic, brighter and stronger than before. The force of it pushed the Ravager back, sending the creature skidding across the earth, its claws dragging deep furrows into the ground. The energy from the catalyst wasn't just a wave, it was a focused stream, sharp and precise. The Ravager staggered to its feet, its body trembling from the impact, but Jacob wasn't finished. He had to end this now. "I can't do this alone," he shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of his power. "I need help." Lyra immediately stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the Ravager, searching for a weak spot. She turned to Jacob, her voice commanding. "Focus the catalyst's energy. We'll distract it. You make the final blow." Jacob's heart raced. He didn't understand how he was supposed to focus the energy, how could he control something so wild? But looking at the creature, its snarling face, the glowing eyes, the twisted shape of its body, he knew there was no other choice. "Now, Jacob," Lyra shouted. The group split into action. Owen lunged back into the fray, distracting the Ravager with a well-aimed strike to its side. Ella joined him, her magic crackling as she hurled bolts of energy at the creature, forcing it to stagger and snarl in frustration. Jacob closed his eyes, focusing. The catalyst. He could feel it pulsing in his hand, almost alive, urging him to channel its energy. But how? A voice deep within him, an ancient, guttural whisper, spoke. Focus. Let go. He didn't question it. His focus sharpened, his mind clearing as he allowed the catalyst's raw power to flow through him, no longer resisting it. The energy surged through his limbs, into the air around him, and focused into a single point. The Ravager turned to face him, its eyes glowing with malevolent rage, but Jacob was ready. With a final, guttural cry, he thrust the catalyst forward. A beam of pure, radiant light erupted from it, cutting through the darkened air with blinding intensity. The Ravager tried to dodge, but it was too slow. The light pierced its body, shattering its dark magic and burning through its flesh. The creature screamed in agony as the light consumed it, its body collapsing in on itself, unable to heal this time. The ground trembled as the Ravager fell to the earth, its monstrous form dissolving into the very air, leaving only a smoldering crater where it had stood. For a long moment, there was silence. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, the glow from the catalyst began to fade, and Jacob sank to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. Ella rushed to his side, helping him sit up. Jacob, you did it. I couldn't have done it without you, he said, his voice hoarse. Without all of you. Owen stumbled over, his breathing heavy but a grin spreading across his face. Well, that was one hell of a fight, he said, clapping Jacob on the back. But next time, we could do without the giant monster, yeah. Lyra approached, her expression unreadable, but there was a glint of approval in her eyes. You've come a long way, Jacob. You may not fully understand it yet, but you just wielded the power of the catalyst better than most ever could. Jacob's heart swelled, but there was still a deep uncertainty inside him. The power of the catalyst. It was dangerous, unpredictable. He could feel it, pulling at him, waiting for him to reach out again. What if he lost control next time? He looked at the relic in his hand. I didn't even know how I did it. You listened, Lyra interrupted. The catalyst doesn't work through force. It works through understanding. You've tapped into something deep within yourself, Jacob. The energy it gives isn't about brute strength, it's about balance. Jacob nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He still didn't understand it fully, but for the first time, he felt like he was starting to grasp the gravity of what lay ahead. We need to keep moving, Lyra said, her tone hardening as she glanced around. The Ravager's death won't go unnoticed. Others will be drawn to this place. And we still have a long way to go. Jacob stood, his legs shaky but determined. The battle may have been won, but the war was far from over. They still had to find the ruins. And the truth about the catalyst, the shards, and whatever dark forces were rising with them. And Jacob knew, deep down, that whatever was coming next would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Let's go, Jacob said, his voice stronger than it had been moments ago. We finish this. And with that, they set off into the unknown, the weight of their mission heavier than ever before. Chapter 11. Shadows in the Deep. The sun had set completely, leaving the forest in eerie darkness, with only the faint glow of the catalyst to guide their way. The thick trees, twisted and gnarled, seemed to loom over them, their branches creaking in the wind as if whispering secrets of ancient times. The air was damp, heavy with moisture, and the constant hum of insects and distant animal calls only added to the sense of isolation. Jacob's mind was still reeling from the fight. The Ravager had been a test of everything he had learned so far, but he could already feel it. Whatever power he had tapped into, it was still unstable. The catalyst hummed faintly in his hand, and he could feel it tugging at him, urging him to use its power again. You all right, Jacob? Ella's voice cut through the silence, and he glanced over to see her walking beside him, her brow furrowed with concern. I'm fine, Jacob replied, though his voice was strained. I don't know what happened back there. The catalyst, it's like it has a mind of its own. Ella gave him a knowing look. It's not easy. Trust me, I know. But I've seen you control it better than anyone else could. Jacob wasn't so sure. The energy inside him felt like a storm, ready to break free at any moment, but he nodded anyway. He didn't want to burden the group with his doubts. They were counting on him. "We're getting close," Lyra's voice called from the front. She had been scouting ahead, her sharp eyes constantly scanning for danger. "The ruins are just beyond this next ridge." The group moved forward, their pace quickening as they neared the destination. Jacob could feel his heart rate picking up, a mixture of excitement and apprehension bubbling in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was something waiting for them just beyond the horizon. And then, they saw it. At the edge of a clearing, hidden beneath layers of ivy and moss, stood the ruins. Towering stone structures, weathered and cracked with age, rose from the earth like the bones of an ancient beast. They were covered in strange, runic carvings that seemed to pulse faintly with an energy that was both familiar and unsettling. "This is it," Lyra said quietly, her voice filled with awe and trepidation. Owen, his eyes scanning the area, remained wary. "We should be cautious. Who knows what kind of traps or creatures might be lurking in there." "Or guardians," Ella added. "If the Ravager was any indication, we're not alone." Jacob looked up at the ruins, feeling a strange pull in his chest. The catalyst seemed to hum louder in his hand, as if recognizing the presence of its kin. It was almost as if the relic itself knew that its purpose was drawing near. "We need to find the entrance," Lyra said, already moving toward the ruins. "Stay alert." The group cautiously approached, weaving their way through the overgrown vines and collapsed walls. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air felt thick, heavy with ancient magic, and the sense of something watching them grew stronger with every step. When they reached the entrance, Jacob couldn't help but feel a chill crawl down his spine. The doorway, framed by two towering stone pillars, was covered in symbols that seemed to shift and writhe as he looked at them. "This place doesn't look welcoming," Owen muttered. Lyra nodded in agreement. "That's because it isn't. These ruins were built to protect something powerful. Whatever is inside, it's more than just relics." "Do you think it's the rest of the catalyst?" Jacob asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lyra hesitated for a moment before answering. "It could be. But it could also be something far darker. We're dealing with forces beyond our comprehension here." Jacob felt the weight of her words settle on him. He had no idea what awaited them inside, but he knew one thing for sure: whatever it was, it wouldn't let them leave easily. He glanced at the others. Owen was adjusting his grip on his sword, ready for whatever came next. Ella was scanning the surroundings, her magic crackling faintly around her fingers. Lyra stood at the front, her expression set in determination. "We go in together," Jacob said, his voice steady. "We stick together, no matter what." With a nod from the others, they stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the ruins. Inside, the air was colder, the darkness deeper. The stone walls were etched with more runes, their faint glow casting eerie shadows on the floor. The further they ventured, the more they could feel the presence of something ancient watching them. And then they came to a large, circular chamber at the heart of the ruins. In the center of the room was a pedestal, atop which lay a massive stone slab, covered in intricate carvings and glowing with a faint, sickly light. Jacob could feel the catalyst reacting to it, the pulse growing stronger as they drew closer. "This is it," Lyra said softly, her voice almost reverent. "This is where the power lies." But as Jacob took a step forward, something changed. The air grew colder, and a deep rumbling sound echoed from the walls. The carvings on the pedestal began to glow brighter, and the ground beneath them trembled. "Something's wrong," Ella said, her voice tight with unease. "It's not just the catalyst, it's something else. Something alive." Before anyone could react, the floor in front of the pedestal cracked open with a deafening noise. From the fissure, a shadowy figure began to rise, tall, cloaked in darkness, with eyes that glowed like embers. It was humanoid, but its form was twisted, its body shifting and warping as if it were made of the very shadows themselves. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. The creature's presence was overwhelming, and he could feel the magic in the air thickening, wrapping around him like a vice. It was powerful, more powerful than anything they had faced so far. "It's a guardian," Lyra whispered, her voice low with dread. "A being of pure shadow, bound to protect the heart of these ruins. We're in its domain now." The creature's eyes locked onto Jacob, and a deep, guttural voice echoed in his mind. "You are too late." The power of the catalyst belongs to the shadows. You will never control it. Jacob's blood ran cold. The creature's words felt like a prophecy, a warning that they were far out of their depth. But he wasn't about to back down now. Not today, Jacob said, his voice stronger than he felt. He raised the catalyst, feeling its energy surge once more. And as the guardian of the ruins advanced, its shadowy form flickering in the air like smoke, Jacob knew one thing: this was only the beginning. The true battle was about to begin. Chapter 12. The Heart of Shadows. The shadowy figure loomed before them, its dark form flickering like a living wisp of smoke, its glowing ember eyes fixed on Jacob. The air was heavy with ancient power, the oppressive energy pressing down on him, making his chest tighten with every breath. It was like the very walls of the ruins were alive, closing in around them. Jacob could feel the catalyst pulsing in his hand, as though it were aware of the danger. The energy was both a comfort and a challenge. He could feel the power inside him, surging like a river, but it was still too wild. He wasn't sure he could control it, not against something so ancient, so powerful. The creature's form twisted, its shadowy body elongating and contracting in a sickening rhythm, like it was trying to consume the very space around them. Then, it spoke again, its voice like a deep, grinding growl that rattled his bones. You do not understand what you are tampering with. This power is not yours to command. Jacob clenched his fists around the catalyst. I don't care what you are. I'm not letting you stop us. The creature's laugh was chilling, its shadow swirling like a storm. You are nothing but a child playing with fire. Do you think you can stop me? You cannot even control your own power. The walls of the chamber trembled, and Jacob felt the pressure in the air intensify. He had to act fast. Stay back, Lyra ordered, stepping forward. Her bow was drawn, the tip of the arrow glowing with magic. We'll distract it. Jacob, find a way to use the catalyst. If it's connected to this place, we need to neutralize it. The creature's eyes flared, and it surged forward with incredible speed, its shadowy tendrils reaching for them. Ella reacted first, raising her hands and sending a blast of energy toward the creature, but it absorbed the magic, the shadows swirling around it like an impenetrable barrier. The guardian's gaze turned to her, its shadowy arms reaching out in retaliation. Foolish mortals, it hissed, its voice full of disdain. Owen stepped forward with a battle cry, his sword raised. He slashed at the shadows, but they merely parted around his blade like mist. The guardian was too powerful, too elusive. Jacob, Lyra shouted, it's all you. Focus the catalyst. Jacob's heart raced. He couldn't let his friends fight this thing alone. The catalyst pulsed again in his hand, its glow brighter now, as if calling to him. He knew it was trying to connect, trying to guide him, but how? The creature lunged at him, its form distorting and coiling in midair, and before Jacob could react, it was upon him. Cold tendrils wrapped around his body, squeezing tight, draining the air from his lungs. The shadow consumed him, pulling him into darkness. For a moment, everything went black. Then, something inside Jacob snapped. A surge of power, far more intense than anything he had felt before, rushed through him. It was like a dam breaking, the raw energy flooding every part of him, flooding the catalyst. He could feel the relic growing hot in his hands, the power it contained sinking with his very being. His mind was no longer his own. The catalyst was part of him now. And the shadow before him. It was nothing. With a scream of defiance, Jacob released the energy. A beam of light, brighter than the sun itself, erupted from the catalyst, slicing through the air. It shattered the shadowy tendrils wrapping around him, forcing them to disintegrate into dust. The guardian howled in fury as the beam struck it, sending a shockwave of light across the chamber. But it wasn't enough. The guardian wasn't defeated yet. You think you can destroy me? The creature snarled, its form flickering as it reformed. This place is mine. I am the keeper of the heart of the ruins. You will never control the power you seek. Jacob gritted his teeth. The guardian's voice echoed in his mind, taunting him, but he wouldn't back down. He couldn't. We're not backing down, Owen shouted, charging forward again, sword raised high. He swung at the shadow, the blade cutting through the air with precision. The guardian flinched, but it was still standing. It was healing, regenerating. It wouldn't stay down for long. Jacob, Lyra's voice broke through the chaos. Focus. You have to push through. The catalyst isn't just about power, it's about connection. The Guardian's power comes from this place. You have to sever that connection. Jacob nodded, though his thoughts were racing. How could he sever the connection? How could he control something so vast, so ancient? He looked around the chamber, his gaze falling on the pedestal where the stone slab lay. The runes on it were glowing brighter, pulsing in sync with the Guardian's movements. The power was coming from that slab, it had to be. Lyra, Jacob shouted, cover me, I'm going to try something. Lyra nodded, her expression grim but determined. She loosed an arrow, striking the Guardian in its form, momentarily distracting it. Jacob took a deep breath, his mind clear. He could feel the catalyst's energy, its connection to the stone. He had to trust it. Stepping forward, he reached out with one hand toward the stone slab. As his fingers brushed against it, a surge of energy shot through him, brighter, stronger than anything he had experienced. The connection between the catalyst and the stone was instantaneous, as if they were meant to be together. The room seemed to warp around him, the power of the slab coursing through him like liquid fire. He could feel the Guardian's presence fighting against him, its shadowy tendrils wrapping around him, trying to push him away. But he wouldn't let go. With every ounce of strength, he pushed the catalyst's energy into the slab, forcing the two powers to clash. The Guardian howled in fury, but it was weakening. The stone's power was waning, and with it, the creature's hold over the ruins. Jacob. Lyra's voice was distant, but clear. You can do it. The energy flared, the room shaking violently. The Guardian writhed, its form beginning to collapse under the weight of the energy. Jacob could feel it. He was breaking the connection, severing the Guardian's hold on the ruins. With a final, resounding crack, the shadow collapsed into nothing, its form dissipating into the air like smoke. The energy in the room settled, leaving only the hum of the catalyst in Jacob's hands. The chamber was silent. Jacob stood, panting, his body aching from the effort. His hands were trembling, and the catalyst still pulsed softly, its power now under control. He looked at the others, who were equally exhausted, but alive. It's over, Ella said, her voice quiet but relieved. Jacob nodded, though his mind was still reeling. They had won, for now. But the power inside him, inside the catalyst, was still a mystery. And whatever they had unleashed in this place, it wasn't over. What now? Owen asked, his voice weary. Jacob glanced at the stone slab, still glowing faintly. We keep going. We need answers, and we're not leaving until we get them. The Heart of Shadows may have been defeated, but something deeper still awaited them in the darkness. Chapter 13. Secrets Beneath the Stone. The air in the chamber was thick with the aftermath of their battle, the silence almost suffocating. The stone slab before Jacob still hummed with a faint, eerie light, its runes now dimmed but not entirely extinguished. As the dust settled, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of something much larger, something that could change everything. His breath still came in shallow gasps, his heart pounding from the battle with the Shadow Guardian, but his mind was already racing, trying to piece together what had just happened. He had felt the power surge through him, but he hadn't understood what it meant. How had he controlled it? How had the catalyst reacted so forcefully? Lyra stepped up beside him, her eyes still sharp, though there was a trace of awe in her expression. Jacob, that was incredible. Jacob didn't respond immediately. He was too focused on the slab. The stone felt almost alive under his fingers, its surface warm, pulsing with a strange energy that he couldn't place. It was like it was waiting for him to understand something, waiting for him to finish what had been started. This stone, it's more than just a relic, isn't it? He muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Much more, Lyra said, her voice quiet but serious. That stone is the key to the catalyst's power. It's a conduit, something far older than any of us could have imagined. Jacob glanced up at her, his brow furrowed. A conduit? You mean it channels the catalyst's power? Lyra nodded. Exactly, but it's also connected to the source. The Shadow Guardian was only a manifestation of that source. Whatever lies beneath this place, deep within these ruins, is where the real power comes from. Ella moved forward, her eyes narrowed as she examined the slab more closely. So, what are we dealing with here? Is there a way to use this power for good, or is it just going to destroy everything in its path? Lyra hesitated before answering. That's the question we need to answer. If the catalyst is tied to this place, then we're dealing with a force that has the potential to change the world. But we don't know the full extent of it yet. We need to explore deeper. The words hung heavy in the air, and Jacob could feel a sense of unease creeping into his chest. Deeper. The word echoed in his mind as he looked around the chamber, the ruins stretching outward into shadows. Where do we even begin? Owen asked, glancing at the others. We've already fought off a guardian. What else could be down here? That's exactly what we need to find out, Lyra said, stepping toward a narrow passageway at the back of the chamber. This chamber wasn't meant to be the end. It's only the beginning. There's a deeper level beneath the stone. That's where we'll find the truth. Jacob swallowed hard. He had no idea what lay beyond that passage, no idea what the stone was truly capable of. But one thing was certain. They couldn't turn back now. They had come this far, and there were too many unanswered questions. I'm in, Jacob said, his voice steady despite the gnawing fear in his gut. The others nodded, and together, they moved toward the dark passage. The air grew colder as they entered, the narrow hallway stretching into the unknown. The walls were lined with ancient carvings, far older than the runes in the main chamber, and they pulsed with a faint, unsettling light. The deeper they went, the stronger the pull of the catalyst became, and Jacob could feel the energy thrumming inside him, urging him forward. After what felt like hours, they arrived at the end of the passage. The walls opened into a massive, cavernous chamber, far larger than anything they had encountered so far. At the center of the room stood an altar, its surface covered in dust and remnants of long-forgotten rituals. The air was thick with the scent of ancient incense, and the dim light from the catalyst cast strange shadows across the room. And there, on the altar, was the source. A crystalline object, unlike anything Jacob had ever seen before. It was translucent, glowing with an inner light that seemed to shift and change with every passing second. It was a perfect sphere, suspended in midair by an unseen force, pulsing in rhythm with the catalyst in Jacob's hand. This is it, Lyra whispered, her voice reverent. This is what we've been searching for. Jacob stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The energy from the object in front of him was unlike anything he had ever felt. It was pure, untamed and wild, like the raw force of creation itself. And yet, there was something about it that felt wrong. The catalyst hummed in his hand, its glow now blinding, as if recognizing its counterpart. Jacob hesitated for a moment, his fingers itching to reach out, to connect with the power that was so close. But he knew better than to act recklessly. Is this the true source of the catalyst's power? Jacob asked, his voice shaky. Lyra nodded. Yes, this is what binds everything together. But it's not just power. It's a living force. Something ancient, something tied to the very fabric of reality. A cold shiver ran down Jacob's spine. He didn't know what would happen if he touched it, if the catalyst's power would somehow merge with the crystal, or if it would destroy him in the process. But there was no turning back now. I have to try, Jacob said, his voice filled with determination. Before anyone could stop him, Jacob reached out, his fingers brushing the surface of the crystal. Instantly, the world around him erupted in a blinding flash of light. He felt himself falling, his body weightless as the energy surged through him, overwhelming every sense. The ground beneath him disappeared, and he was surrounded by nothing but a bright, swirling void. The pain was unbearable. It felt like his very soul was being ripped apart, torn between the forces of the catalyst and the crystal. The power surged through him in waves, each one more intense than the last. His body screamed in agony, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't pull away. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished. Jacob fell to his knees, gasping for air, his hands trembling. The cavern was silent again, the crystal still floating above the altar, its light now dimmer. But something had changed. Jacob looked down at his hands, still shaking, and then up at the others. The world felt different, like he had crossed some invisible threshold. I don't understand, Jacob muttered, his voice hoarse. What just happened? Lyra's eyes were wide with shock as she stepped forward. Jacob, your aura, it's different. You're glowing. Jacob blinked, trying to focus. He felt strange, like something inside him had shifted. It wasn't just the catalyst anymore, it was something more. Ella moved closer, her expression a mixture of awe and caution. What do you mean, glowing? Jacob took a deep breath, willing himself to stand. The light from the catalyst flared once more, but now it was no longer a mere pulse, it was a part of him, a radiant energy that surrounded his body like a second skin. I think I've unlocked something, Jacob whispered, his voice filled with wonder. But what it is, I don't know yet. They were no longer just facing the unknown. Now, they were part of it. Chapter 14. The Price of Power. Jacob stared down at his glowing hands, the light emanating from them like a beacon in the dark cavern. The sensation was overwhelming. Like every part of him was alive, humming with energy, as if he had become part of the very forces that governed this place. But with it came a weight, a heaviness that settled deep in his chest. The others gathered around him, their eyes wide with disbelief, but there was something else in their expressions, concern. It was as if they could sense the cost of what had just happened, even if they didn't understand it fully. What is this? Lyra asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes studying Jacob closely. Jacob tried to focus on her words, but it was like the very air was charged with electricity, buzzing around him. He swallowed hard, feeling the power inside him, pushing against the confines of his body. It was exhilarating, yet terrifying at the same time. I don't know, Jacob replied, his voice shaky. It's like the catalyst has merged with me. I can feel it, coursing through me. Ella stepped closer, her brows furrowed. But the light, it's not just coming from the catalyst anymore. It's coming from you. You're glowing, Jacob. What did you do? Jacob opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the ground beneath them trembled. The cavern shook with a deep rumble, and a low, menacing sound echoed through the stone walls. The crystal on the altar pulsed in response, its glow flickering wildly as if reacting to something unseen. Something's happening, Owen said, his hand on the hilt of his sword, his eyes scanning the room. We need to get out of here. Now. Before Jacob could even think to respond, the chamber's walls began to crack. Splinters of rock fell from the ceiling, and dust billowed into the air, swirling in chaotic patterns. The pulse of the crystal grew stronger, more erratic, as if it were feeding off the energy inside Jacob, feeding off the power he had just unlocked. Jacob, Lyra called urgently, grabbing his arm. We have to go. The longer we stay, the more unstable this place will become. This power is dangerous. It's not just for you to control. Jacob could barely hear her over the roar of the shifting stone. His thoughts were scattered, the power inside him pulling him in all directions, urging him to do something. Anything. It was like a dam breaking inside his chest. I can't control it, Jacob shouted, his voice laced with panic. The light from his hands flickered, surging out of him in erratic pulses, each one more intense than the last. The cavern trembled again, and this time, it felt different. There was a deep, menacing force pressing against them from all sides. Something ancient and hungry. Jacob, Lyra snapped, listen to me. The more you use the catalyst, the more it will pull on you. The power is too much for one person to handle. If you don't let it go, it will destroy everything. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest as he felt the pressure building inside him. He couldn't breathe. The air around him was thick with energy, with power. The catalyst was inside him, part of him, and he didn't know how to stop it. Lyra, Jacob gasped, his voice strained. What do I do? You have to sever the connection. She urged. You can't keep this power, Jacob. It's not meant for a single person to wield. You have to let go. Jacob shook his head, tears of frustration stinging his eyes. He couldn't. He didn't want to. The power was incredible. It was like nothing he had ever felt before. How could he just give it up? Before he could respond, the walls of the cavern cracked open, and a new force surged from deep below. The ground shook violently, and the entire room seemed to collapse inward. A dark, swirling mist poured into the chamber from the cracks in the stone. It was alive, moving with purpose, coiling like a serpent around them. What is that? Ella gasped, her voice barely audible over the chaos. That's what we've unleashed, Lyra said, her voice tight with fear. The power from the source, it's trying to consume everything. The mist grew thicker, wrapping around their legs, pulling at them like it had a mind of its own. Jacob could feel the tendrils of dark energy clawing at his skin, like cold fingers grasping him from all sides. It was feeding on the power he had unleashed, and now, it was coming for them. Jacob, Owen shouted, his voice laced with panic. You have to stop it. Jacob closed his eyes, the world spinning around him. The pressure inside him was unbearable, and the power from the catalyst was still pulsing, thrumming like a heartbeat. He couldn't hold it back. Not on his own. With a shout of frustration, Jacob raised his hands, trying to push the power back, to stop the oncoming tide. But the more he tried, the stronger it became. It was like he was trying to stop a flood with his bare hands. Jacob, Lyra screamed, her voice breaking through the chaos. You're going to tear yourself apart. You have to sever the bond. Let it go. Jacob's chest ached, his heart pounding against the walls of his ribcage. He couldn't breathe. The power was inside him, coursing through his veins, and he didn't know how to stop it. And then, in that moment of desperation, something inside him clicked. He had to choose. He had to let go. With every ounce of willpower, Jacob focused on the energy inside him, the power of the catalyst, and he willed it to stop. To release its grip on him. He focused on severing the connection, on undoing the link that had bound him to the crystal. At first, nothing happened. The energy surged, pulling him deeper into the darkness. But then, slowly, the pull began to weaken. The light from his hands flickered, dimming as the power inside him began to recede. Jacob gasped for air, his body trembling with the effort. The dark mist retreated, vanishing into the cracks in the stone, and the ground stopped shaking. The pressure in the air lifted, and the cavern began to settle. But Jacob wasn't sure if he had truly won. He collapsed to his knees, exhausted, the glow from his hands finally fading. His body felt like it was made of lead, every muscle aching, his heart still racing from the surge of power. Lyra rushed to his side, her expression full of concern. Jacob, are you okay? Jacob nodded weakly, though he didn't feel okay. The power inside him was still there, lingering, but it was no longer consuming him. It was quieter now, subdued. I think I stopped it, Jacob murmured, barely able to speak. Ella knelt beside him, her eyes full of relief. But at what cost? Jacob looked at his hands, feeling the weight of what had happened. He had survived, but the cost of that survival was still unclear. The catalyst had given him power, but it had taken something from him in return. I don't know, Jacob said, his voice trembling. But I don't think we're done yet. This isn't over. And deep in his heart, Jacob knew it. The power he had tapped into was far from gone. It was waiting for him, waiting for the next step. The real journey had only just begun. Chapter 15. The Tipping Point. The cavern was eerily quiet now, save for the sound of their uneven breathing and the faint echo of the last tremors still fading beneath their feet. Jacob remained on his knees, his body still trembling from the strain of holding back the catalyst's overwhelming force. The glow from his hands had faded, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air, thick and heavy. Lyra crouched beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Jacob, I know this is a lot. But we have to keep moving. There's no time to waste. Jacob nodded weakly, still trying to shake off the dizziness. The power, the catalyst, still pulsed within him, but it was quieter now, almost dormant. It wasn't gone. No, it was only waiting. Ella glanced around the cavern, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the shadows. That thing we saw earlier, the mist, it's not gone. It's just hiding. We need to figure out what it is before it comes back for us. Jacob's heart sank at her words. He didn't want to think about the mist, or the dark force that had nearly consumed them all. But he knew Ella was right. They had barely survived the last wave, and now they were standing in the aftermath, with no idea what kind of enemy was lurking in the darkness. We have no choice but to keep going, Owen said, his voice low but firm. The catalyst is still out there, and so is whatever is pulling on it. We need to find the source of this power before it finds us first. Jacob took a deep breath, his hands still trembling as he pushed himself to his feet. Every muscle in his body felt like it had been stretched to its limit, but there was no time to rest. They had come too far to turn back now. "Let's move," Jacob said, his voice steady, though his mind was still reeling from the chaos. They made their way deeper into the ruins, the once silent cavern now filled with the sound of their footsteps as they navigated the twisting stone passages. The air was thick with tension, each step seeming to bring them closer to something unknown, something ancient. The walls of the passage were covered in strange symbols, runes that seemed to pulse with a faint energy, like they were alive. Jacob could feel the power growing stronger the further they went, the weight of it pressing on his chest. The catalyst was in him, tied to him, and yet he still had no idea what it really was. What was the true nature of this power he had unlocked? What would it mean for him, and for the world, if he couldn't control it? As they rounded a corner, the path opened up into another vast chamber. This one was different, though. It was no longer just stone and dust. There were strange devices scattered across the floor, mechanical, alien-looking structures that hummed with energy. They appeared ancient, but still functional. In the center of the room, on a raised platform, stood a massive stone structure, covered in intricate carvings. "As that," Lyra whispered, her voice filled with awe and fear. "The source," Jacob finished for her, his eyes locked on the structure. The air in the room grew colder as they stepped closer, the shadows stretching unnaturally around them. It was a pedestal, a platform of sorts, carved from a single, massive stone. But at the center of the platform was something else. It was a dark crystal, larger than any they had encountered so far. It pulsed with a deep, red glow, and Jacob could feel its presence as though it were calling to him. The catalyst inside him responded, its power flickering to life as it sensed the crystal's pull. "This is it," Jacob said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "This is what we've been looking for. This is what's been feeding on the catalyst," Lyra said, her voice low and tense. "This crystal, it's drawing power from you. From all of us." Jacob stepped forward, his heart racing. He could feel the energy from the crystal calling to him, like a magnet pulling him closer. It was tempting, almost seductive. But at the same time, it felt wrong, dark, dangerous. "We have to destroy it," Ella said, her voice cutting through the silence. "We can't let it take any more power. If it keeps feeding off the catalyst, who knows what will happen?" Jacob hesitated. The crystal was so beautiful, so powerful. It called to him with an almost irresistible force. But he had felt its hunger, the way it fed off the energy inside him. It wasn't just a relic. It was alive. "I'm not sure we can destroy it," Jacob said, his voice unsure. "It feels like it's tied to the catalyst. If we try to destroy it, we might destroy ourselves in the process." "We can't just leave it here," Owen said firmly, his hand still gripping his sword. "Whatever it is, it's connected to the darkness we've seen. If we let it live, it will continue to grow stronger." Jacob looked at the others, feeling the weight of their determination pressing down on him. They were right. They couldn't leave it, but how could they defeat something that was as ancient and powerful as this crystal? "I don't know if we have the strength to destroy it," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we have to do something. If we don't, the whole world could be in danger." Lyra nodded, stepping forward with a look of resolve on her face. "We'll figure it out, together." Jacob looked at her, grateful for her unwavering strength. She was right. They couldn't face this alone. They needed to stick together, no matter what. As he stepped closer to the pedestal, the room grew colder still, the air thick with the weight of unseen eyes watching them. The power from the crystal surged, a dark pulse that seemed to shake the very foundation of the chamber. The catalyst in Jacob's hand responded again, its energy flaring as the two forces, light and dark, began to pull at each other. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, the ground beneath them cracked. A deep, rumbling growl echoed through the stone, and the pedestal trembled. The dark crystal began to vibrate, its red glow intensifying. Jacob felt the catalyst surge, the power inside him waking with a roar. It was like he was caught in the middle of two opposing forces, one light and one dark. And both wanted something from him. "Jacob," Lyra shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the sudden explosion of energy. Everything went black. Chapter 16. Shattered Worlds. The air was thick with static, crackling as if reality itself were about to tear open. Jacob's body tensed, every nerve alight with the surge of energy rushing through him. The catalyst, the dark crystal, was pulling at him, tugging on the very core of his being. It was as if he was trapped between two opposing forces, each one trying to claim him for itself. He fought to stay grounded, to maintain control. But it was slipping through his fingers. He could feel the energy in the room building, growing stronger by the second. The ground beneath him shook, and the walls of the cavern began to tremble as the power spiraled out of control. "Jacob," Lyra shouted, but her voice was distant, muffled by the roaring storm of energy. "Focus. You can't let it consume you." It was as if the words were coming from far away. His mind was a battlefield, two worlds colliding in a cataclysmic rush. The dark crystal pulsed again, sending a shockwave of energy through the chamber. Jacob staggered, his body shaking with the impact. His thoughts felt fractured, scattered. He couldn't focus. The power was too overwhelming. It wanted to swallow him whole. Suddenly, everything stopped. The world seemed to freeze, and Jacob felt his body go weightless. It was as if time itself had been suspended, leaving him trapped in a moment that lasted forever. He could hear the faint echo of his heartbeat, but it was the only sound. A presence, dark and ancient, pressed against him. It wasn't a voice, but a feeling, cold and oppressive, yet oddly familiar. The presence enveloped him, drawing him deeper into the abyss. "You are mine," it whispered, the words a cold breeze in his mind. Jacob's heart raced. He could feel the darkness trying to take hold, to claim him as its own. It wanted to corrupt him, to twist him into something he wasn't. But Jacob fought back, digging deep into his core, into the power that was still his. "No," Jacob whispered through gritted teeth, the word a declaration of defiance. The presence recoiled, momentarily startled by his resistance. But Jacob knew it wasn't over. The fight had only just begun. The world around him lurched back into motion. He gasped for air, feeling the weight of his body return. The cavern was still shaking, the stone beneath him cracking. The dark crystal was pulsing violently, its energy tearing at the fabric of reality itself. "Jacob," Lyra cried again, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We have to stop this now." He could see her now, standing across the chamber, her eyes filled with fear. She was right. The longer he stayed connected to the crystal, the more dangerous it became. They were running out of time. Jacob's mind raced, trying to find a solution. The catalyst was a part of him now, but the dark crystal was stronger than he could have anticipated. It was feeding off of him, draining him of his energy, his life. A sudden thought struck him like lightning. The catalyst, he had to sever the connection, not just with the crystal, but with himself. He needed to cut himself free. He extended his hands, palms facing the glowing crystal, and focused. His mind reached out, pushing through the fog of energy that clouded his thoughts. The power inside him surged in response, but he fought to keep it under control, to focus it. It was like trying to tame a storm. Every part of him wanted to break free, to let the power consume him completely. But Jacob held firm. "I won't let you take me," he muttered to himself. The dark presence tried to push back, its grip tightening around his mind, but Jacob refused to give in. He focused on the catalyst within him, the light that had awakened so long ago. Slowly, he began to draw the power back, away from the crystal, pulling it into himself. The room trembled as the forces collided, light and dark warring within him. For a moment, Jacob wasn't sure he could hold on. The energy surged, threatening to tear him apart, but just when he thought he couldn't bear it anymore, the ground beneath him cracked open. The stone walls split, and a deep roar echoed from the depths of the cavern. The crystal flared with one final pulse of energy, and everything seemed to go white. Then, silence. Jacob was on his knees, his body trembling from the effort, his mind racing to catch up. His hands glowed dimly, the faintest trace of the catalyst still inside him. The energy was quieter now, subdued. He had stopped it, but he didn't know how long that would last. "Jacob," Lyra's voice broke through his foggy thoughts, urgent. "Are you okay?" Jacob blinked, trying to focus. The room was still, but the cracks in the walls remained. The dark crystal was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. I think I did it, Jacob said, his voice weak. But even as he spoke, a cold feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. He had stopped the crystal. For now. But the presence, the power, the catalyst, it was all still inside him. And as much as he tried to push it away, he knew it wasn't gone for good. Not by a long shot. We need to get out of here, Owen said, looking around warily. This place is falling apart. And I have a feeling we haven't seen the last of that crystal. Jacob nodded, shakily rising to his feet. Let's go. They turned to leave the chamber, but as they did, a distant rumble echoed through the ruins. It was faint, but unmistakable. Something else was coming. Jacob felt it before he saw it. A shift in the air. A disturbance. The catalyst was stirring again. And this time, it wasn't alone. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. Chapter 17. Echoes of the Past. The ground beneath their feet trembled again, this time more violently. The once stable walls of the cavern began to crack, sending a shower of dust and debris into the air. Jacob's senses were on edge. He could feel it. Something was wrong. We need to move faster. Lyra shouted, her voice sharp with urgency. The team began to sprint, their footsteps echoing through the dark passageways as the rumbling grew louder. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't just fear that drove him forward. It was the strange, unsettling sensation in his mind, the catalyst. It was stirring again, pulling at him, thrumming with a dark energy that he couldn't explain. Where are we going? Owen called over his shoulder, his pace quickening as the ceiling above them groaned ominously. We need to find the exit, Jacob replied, trying to steady his breath. Before whatever that is catches up to us. As they sprinted through the winding passages, Jacob's thoughts raced. The catalyst was becoming more powerful inside him. It was as if the more he used it, the more it grew. And with every use, he could feel it pushing against his own will, threatening to take control. He had already fought against it once, but he knew the next time might be too much. The rumbling grew louder still, and then, a massive crash echoed through the cavern. The walls buckled, sending rocks tumbling down in a cloud of dust. We're running out of time, Ella shouted, her voice strained as she dodged falling debris. Jacob's instincts kicked in. He glanced around quickly, his eyes scanning the dark, twisting passages for any sign of a way out. The walls were closing in on them, the structure of the cavern crumbling as if the very earth were rejecting them. Then, he saw it. In the distance, through the dust and darkness, a faint light flickered. It was weak, barely visible, but it was there. A glimmer of hope. There, Jacob shouted, pointing toward the light. This way. Without hesitation, they followed him, pushing forward through the collapsing ruins. The light grew brighter with each step, and Jacob's pulse quickened. They were close. He could feel it, but the rumbling didn't stop. It only grew more intense. As they neared the light, Jacob's mind was flooded with flashes of memories, images of the crystal, of the catalyst, of the darkness that had consumed him moments before. The air around him seemed to warp, and for a moment, he felt like he was losing his grip on reality. Then, he heard a voice. It wasn't Lyra or Ella. It wasn't Owen or even the catalyst. It was an older voice, ancient, speaking to him through the very walls of the cavern. Jacob Torres, the voice whispered, barely audible over the rumbling. You are the key. Jacob froze in his tracks. The others kept moving, but he stood still, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice had come from everywhere, and nowhere. It reverberated through his mind, as if the very stone of the cavern was speaking to him. You have awakened what was buried, the voice continued, its tone laced with a chilling finality. And now, you must face what you have unleashed. A cold shiver ran down Jacob's spine. He looked around, but no one else seemed to hear the voice. They were still running, unaware of the words that had echoed in his mind. What does it mean? Jacob murmured to himself, trying to make sense of it. Before he could think any further, the ground beneath them cracked open, a deep fissure splitting the path ahead. The air grew thick with energy, and the rumbling intensified until it felt as though the entire world was on the brink of collapse. We don't have time, Lyra shouted, her voice filled with panic as she turned back to Jacob. Without thinking, Jacob reached out, his hands instinctively drawing on the power of the catalyst. It flared to life, but this time, it felt different. The energy surged through him with an almost unbearable force, pulling at every fiber of his being. The fissure widened, and from the depths of the earth, something began to emerge. A dark, shadowy figure, its form shifting and undulating like smoke, rose from the crack. It was massive, its silhouette almost blurring as it grew taller, stretching upward like a nightmare taking shape. Jacob's stomach churned with fear. The presence he had felt earlier, the one that had tried to claim him, was back. But now, it was here in physical form. "What is that?" Owen demanded, his voice laced with fear. "That," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is what we've been running from. The source of the catalyst's power." The creature, its body made of swirling shadows and crackling energy, loomed before them. It was an ancient being, born from the very darkness that had plagued the world long before Jacob had come into the picture. It had been waiting, watching, and now it was ready to finish what it had started. Without warning, the creature lunged forward, its massive form moving with unnatural speed. It slammed into the ground with a deafening crash, sending a shockwave through the cavern that knocked Jacob and the others off their feet. Jacob struggled to get up, but the force of the impact left him winded. The catalyst inside him pulsed erratically, responding to the creature's presence. It wanted to fight, but it also wanted to run. "Jacob, we need a plan," Lyra shouted, scrambling to her feet. The creature's shadowy tendrils lashed out, striking the ground with the force of 1,000 lightning bolts. Jacob barely dodged, the air sizzling with energy as the darkness spread across the cavern floor. He had to act fast. The catalyst, the power within him, was the only thing that could stand up to this creature. But he wasn't sure he could control it. He wasn't sure if he even wanted to. The voice echoed in his mind again, whispering softly, "You are the key, Jacob Torres. But not to what you think." Jacob's mind raced, and then, in that moment of clarity, he understood. The catalyst wasn't just power, it was the key to unlocking something far greater. Something ancient. Something that had been buried for a reason. "Stay close," Jacob shouted to the group, pushing the doubt aside. "I know what we need to do. But I need your help." As the creature advanced, its tendrils writhing, Jacob stepped forward, summoning the catalyst with every ounce of strength he had left. The energy flared, bright and painful, as he began to harness it in a way he had never done before. The battle had begun, and Jacob Torres wasn't about to back down. Chapter 18. The Heart of Darkness. Jacob's hands burned with the raw power of the catalyst. It surged within him like an untamed fire, thrashing at the edges of his control. The shadowy creature in front of him loomed larger, its tendrils stretching toward the group with a menacing grace. Every instinct in Jacob told him to retreat, but he couldn't. Not now, not with everything at stake. The darkness crackled, shifting as if alive, as it charged toward them with blinding speed. Jacob's heart raced, but his mind was sharp. He had to focus. The catalyst wasn't just about raw power, it was about control. He had learned that the hard way. This time, he would control it, or it would control him. "Jacob, look out," Lyra shouted. Jacob barely had time to react before a tendril shot toward him, aiming to strike him down. His instincts kicked in. He thrust out his hands, channeling the catalyst's energy outward in a flash of blinding light. The tendril froze midair, crackling with electricity, before it was thrown back, disintegrating into smoke. The force of the blast knocked Jacob back, his body slamming against the cavern wall. Pain exploded through his ribs, but he didn't have time to register it. The creature was coming again. "This is insane," Owen shouted, barely dodging another strike from the creature's tendrils. "We can't keep this up forever." "Focus," Jacob yelled back, getting to his feet with a groan. His vision swam for a moment, but he shook it off. "I can do this," the creature hissed, its form writhing as the dark energy that composed it pulsed with malevolent intent. Jacob could feel the malevolence reaching out for him, trying to seep into his mind, to twist his thoughts. The ancient voice from earlier echoed again, colder this time. "You cannot control it, Jacob Torres. It is too much for you. The words gnawed at him. They were a temptation, a whisper of doubt. But Jacob fought it, clenching his fists, drawing even more of the catalyst's power into him. His hands were glowing brightly now, their light cutting through the darkness, like a beacon in the blackest night. He was no longer just defending himself, he was attacking. With each pulse of energy, he struck at the creature, each blow sending shockwaves that rocked the cavern. The creature screamed, an unholy wail that reverberated through the stone walls, rattling their bones. But it wasn't enough. For every blow Jacob struck, the creature seemed to regenerate, its shadowy form flowing back together, its tendrils multiplying like twisted vines. "We can't just keep hitting it," Lyra said, panting. "There has to be another way." Jacob knew she was right. They were running out of time, and the creature was too powerful. The catalyst might have the power to fight it, but there was something deeper at play, something that felt ancient and beyond even his understanding. Then, it hit him. The voice. The catalyst had chosen him. But why? What was its true purpose? And why had the creature appeared now, after all this time? There was a connection. A deep, dark connection. Jacob didn't fully understand it, but he knew he had to uncover the truth before they were all consumed. "I need you to trust me," Jacob said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I'm going to draw the creature in. You all need to be ready." "You're insane," Owen shouted. "I know," Jacob replied with a grim smile. "But it's the only way." With a deep breath, Jacob extended his hands, palms outstretched, summoning the full force of the catalyst. The energy within him flared to life again, brighter this time, hotter, as if it was alive, as if it was waiting for this moment. He could feel the power building inside him, pushing against his chest, begging for release. The creature lunged, its tendrils aimed directly at him, but Jacob held his ground. The dark force was close now, too close. He could feel its presence wrapping around him, its cold, poisonous whispers in his mind, urging him to give in. To let go, to let it take him. But Jacob didn't. He summoned every ounce of his strength and sent out a pulse of energy, one that wasn't just physical, but mental. He reached into the core of the catalyst, into the very heart of the darkness it had awakened, and pulled. And then, in an instant, everything changed. A blinding light exploded from his body, radiating outward, filling the cavern with its intensity. The creature screeched in agony, its form writhing and flickering as it was torn apart by the power Jacob had unleashed. Its tendrils disintegrated in midair, evaporating into thin wisps of smoke, until finally, the creature let out one last, agonized roar before it dissolved completely into nothing. The light from Jacob's hands began to fade, but he remained standing, trembling, his body humming with the aftershock of the power he had just channeled. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, his chest heaving. "It's over?" Owen asked, voice filled with disbelief. For a moment, no one said anything. The cavern was still, the oppressive darkness gone. The only sound was the echo of their breathing, the quiet hum of Jacob's still glowing hands. But Jacob wasn't so sure it was over. "No," he said hoarsely, glancing around. "It's not over." He could still feel the power within him, the catalyst, whispering, beckoning. There was something else he needed to do. The battle might have been won, but the war was far from over. And whatever he had unleashed tonight was only the beginning. Lyra stepped closer, her expression concerned. "Jacob, what's wrong? You're shaking." He looked at her, his eyes dark with uncertainty. "I don't know what I've just done. But I think it's far from over." The truth was clear. The creature had been just a pawn, a shadow of the real force that was awakening, one that had been dormant for centuries, hidden beneath the surface of everything Jacob had thought he knew. As the group regrouped, Jacob looked down at his glowing hands, knowing deep in his soul that this was just the beginning. The catalyst had chosen him. But it was also choosing something else. Something he couldn't yet comprehend. But soon, he would. And when he did, it would change everything. The darkness was not finished. It was just beginning to show its true face. And Jacob Torres would have to face it, whether he was ready or not. Chapter 19. A New Purpose. The darkness that had plagued the cavern was now gone, but the silence that replaced it was just as unsettling. Jacob sat on the cold stone floor, still trembling from the power he had unleashed. His hands were still glowing faintly, the warm pulse of the catalyst radiating from within him. The quiet hum was soothing, but it also made his skin prickle with the reminder that the creature was only the beginning. "Jacob," Lyra said softly, kneeling beside him. Her voice held both concern and awe, but there was something else, something he couldn't quite place. "Are you okay?" Jacob nodded slowly, though he didn't feel okay. His body was physically drained, but his mind was racing. The battle was over, but the truth was becoming clearer with every passing moment. The catalyst inside him had responded to the creature, had taken it down in a way that felt almost too easy. "What was that?" Ella asked, her voice still filled with awe. "How did you do that? It was like you were glowing. Like you weren't even human." Jacob shook his head, his thoughts swirling in a vortex of confusion. "I don't know. It felt like I was using the catalyst to fight, but also something more. Something I can't control. And the voice. That voice in my head. It kept telling me I was the key." "The key to what?" Owen asked, his brows furrowed. Jacob stood, brushing off the dust from his clothes. "I don't know, but I think we've only seen the beginning of whatever is happening." There was a weight in the air now. Not the oppressive darkness of the creature, but something deeper. Something ancient and powerful, pressing in on him from all sides. The catalyst wasn't just a power, it was a calling. And Jacob had no idea what it wanted from him. "We need to get out of here," Lyra said, breaking the silence. She stood and offered Jacob a hand. "There's no telling what else might be down here." Jacob took her hand, rising to his feet. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this place, the cavern, the catalyst, the creature, had all been waiting for him. It had all led up to this moment. As the group began to move back toward the exit, Jacob's mind continued to churn. He had faced the darkness, but he had only scratched the surface of what lay ahead. He could feel the pull of the catalyst, almost like a tether inside him, guiding him toward something. Something he couldn't understand yet. They made their way through the tunnels, the flickering light of their torches the only source of illumination in the darkness. The cavern was eerily quiet now, but Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed to stretch and move, as if the walls themselves were alive. Finally, after what felt like hours, they emerged into the open air, the bright sunlight blinding after the long, suffocating darkness of the caves. The team stood on the edge of a cliff, overlooking a vast, green valley below. The wind whipped around them, carrying with it the scent of fresh air and freedom. But even here, Jacob couldn't escape the pull of the catalyst. He looked out over the valley, but his mind was elsewhere. The voice had spoken to him again, its words haunting and cryptic. "You are the key. But not to what you think." "What happens now?" Lyra asked, breaking the silence. She turned to Jacob, her eyes searching his face. Jacob looked at her, his mind spinning. He had no answers, no clear path forward. But he knew one thing for sure. Whatever the catalyst was, it had chosen him for a reason. And he wasn't going to stop until he figured out what that reason was. "We keep moving," Jacob said, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. "There's more to this. We've only just begun to understand what's happening." Owen looked uneasy. "You're telling me we're just going to keep chasing after whatever that thing was?" Jacob met his gaze, his eyes hardening. "Yes, if I don't stop now, it'll only get worse. And we won't be ready for it." Lyra gave him a solemn nod, while Ella glanced around, clearly unsettled. "We're with you, Jacob. But what do we do next?" Jacob took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. He didn't have all the answers yet. He didn't even have a clear plan. But he knew one thing. The catalyst was calling to him. And wherever it led, they would follow. "We need to find out more about the catalyst. We need to understand what it really is, and what it's connected to." The group exchanged uneasy looks, but there was a shared sense of resolve. They had been through too much together to back down now. Jacob turned to look at the valley again, his mind whirling with possibilities. The catalyst had unlocked something deep within him. It had shown him a power he hadn't even known existed. But the creature, that thing, was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. And Jacob Torres wasn't going to stop until he had all the pieces. As they made their way down the cliff, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, Jacob could feel it. The weight of the responsibility, the sense of destiny pulling him forward. The catalyst had chosen him, and now he had to find out why. The journey ahead would be perilous. The darkness wasn't done with him yet. But Jacob wasn't afraid, because now, for the first time, he understood, the catalyst wasn't just a force to be controlled. It was a part of him. And together, they would change the world. And that was just the beginning. Chapter 20. The Hidden Truth. The sun set slowly behind them as Jacob and the group made their way toward the distant horizon. The world around them seemed peaceful, serene even, but beneath the calm surface, Jacob could feel the pulse of the catalyst, urging him forward. It wasn't just a power. It was a force that was shaping him, and with every step, he felt himself being drawn deeper into something much larger than he could comprehend. "I don't like this," Owen muttered as they walked. He glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting something to jump out of the shadows. "It's too quiet." "I agree," Lyra said, her eyes scanning the surrounding forest. "We're not the only ones out here. I can feel it." Ella, walking alongside them, looked nervous but determined. "Are we sure we want to keep going? We've faced enough today, don't you think?" Jacob didn't reply immediately. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the catalyst was pushing him toward something. It was as if he was being called by something in the distance, something that only he could sense. "I don't know what's out there," Jacob said, his voice steady but with an edge of urgency. "But I know we have to keep moving. We need answers, and I don't think we'll find them sitting around." There was silence for a moment as the group continued to walk. Jacob's mind was a storm of thoughts, each one trying to piece together the puzzle that had been set before him. He had faced the creature, tapped into the catalyst's power, and now he could feel something shifting, something waiting for him. The others seemed to sense the change in him. There was a tension in the air, thick and palpable. They knew Jacob wasn't the same as he had been before. There was something different about him now, a resolve, an intensity that hadn't been there before. It wasn't long before they came to a clearing, and in the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone archway. The stones were covered in vines, and the air around it felt charged with energy. Jacob stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes locked on the arch. "What is that?" Lyra whispered, almost to herself. She stepped closer, her fingers lightly brushing one of the stones. "It's old, very old." Jacob felt a pull, an undeniable urge to step forward. The catalyst inside him thrummed with recognition, as if it knew exactly what this was. His heart beat faster as he approached the archway, his feet moving without thought. "Jacob, wait," Owen called out, but Jacob didn't stop. He couldn't. The pull was too strong. He reached the center of the arch, and as he stepped through it, the world around him seemed to blur. A rush of energy flooded his body, overwhelming his senses. His vision blurred, then sharpened, and in the span of a breath, he was no longer standing in the clearing. He was somewhere else entirely. The landscape around him was stark and unfamiliar. Jagged mountains stretched into the sky, and a river of molten lava flowed beneath a blood-red sky. The air was thick with the scent of ash and sulfur, and a chilling wind whipped through the barren landscape. Where am I?" Jacob gasped, taking a step back. The others were nowhere to be seen, and Jacob was alone in this strange, desolate place. But as he stood there, trying to make sense of what was happening, he felt it again, the pull. The catalyst was guiding him deeper into this twisted world. Then, through the smoke and haze, a figure appeared. It was a man, tall and cloaked in shadow. His face was obscured, but Jacob could feel the weight of his gaze, even from a distance. There was a coldness in the figure's presence, an ancient power that resonated with the catalyst. "Jacob Torres," the figure said, his voice echoing across the barren landscape. "So, you've come at last." Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. "Who are you?" The figure took a step forward, the ground trembling with each movement. "I am the one who has been waiting for you. The one who has been watching as the catalyst has chosen its vessel. I am the guardian of this world, the keeper of the truths hidden within." Jacob's mind raced. The catalyst had chosen him, and now it seemed to have led him to this place. But why? What was this figure? And what did he mean by the guardian? "Why me?" Jacob asked, his voice hoarse. "Why has the catalyst chosen me? The figure tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Because you are the key. The key to the balance of this world and many others. The catalyst is not just a power, it is a force of nature. A force that is meant to be wielded by one who is worthy. A force that can change the fate of worlds. Jacob felt a chill crawl up his spine. But I don't understand. What do you want from me? The figure stepped closer, the air growing colder with each step. I do not want anything from you, Jacob Torres. You are already bound to the catalyst. What I offer is a choice that will decide the fate of all that you know. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. A choice. What kind of choice? The figure's voice dropped to a whisper. You can choose to wield the catalyst, to embrace its power and use it to shape the future. Or, you can choose to let it destroy you, to let the darkness consume everything. The choice is yours. Jacob's mind whirled. The weight of the decision was heavy, almost suffocating. He had always known the catalyst was dangerous, but now it seemed like the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. This wasn't just about him. This was about the fate of entire worlds. What happens if I choose wrong? Jacob asked, his voice barely audible. The figure's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then the darkness will spread. The catalyst will turn against you, and you will be nothing more than a pawn in a game far older than you can understand. Jacob felt a surge of panic, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it soon. Before he could say anything else, the figure spoke again. You have no time left, Jacob Torres. The darkness is already awakening. The question is, will you stand against it, or will you fall with it? Jacob's mind raced, but before he could respond, the world around him started to crack, the air growing thick and oppressive. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and a deep rumble echoed from the distance. Jacob, a voice cried out from somewhere. It was Lyra. Jacob, come back. But it was too late. The ground split open, and everything around him dissolved into darkness. Chapter 21. The Breaking Point. Jacob gasped as the world around him shattered into pieces, like glass breaking into 1,000 shards. The landscape, the figure, and even the air itself seemed to collapse and fold in on itself. He had only a moment to register the sensation of falling, the crushing weight of nothingness surrounding him, before everything snapped back into focus. He was back in the clearing. The cool wind brushed against his skin, and the familiar scent of the forest filled his nostrils. For a moment, Jacob thought he might be dreaming. The chaos, the desolate world, the figure, it all felt too real to be anything but a nightmare. But no, he was here. He was back in the clearing with his friends. Jacob. Lyra's voice rang out in relief, and before Jacob could even blink, she was at his side, her eyes wide with concern. What happened? You just disappeared. We couldn't find you. Jacob shook his head, still trying to wrap his mind around everything. I don't know. 1 minute I was standing in front of that archway, and then I was somewhere else. It felt real, like I was in another world. There was a figure, a guardian, telling me that I had a choice to make. A choice? Ella asked, her brow furrowed. What kind of choice? Jacob's voice faltered. He said I could choose to wield the catalyst, to use its power, or I could let it destroy me. He said I'm the key to something bigger, something that could affect all of reality. Owen looked uneasy. That sounds dangerous. You didn't make any decisions, right? Jacob glanced back at the archway, now standing silent and still in the center of the clearing. There was no sign of the other world, no trace of the dark, oppressive atmosphere that had gripped him moments before. But the words of the guardian still echoed in his mind. I didn't make a choice, Jacob said, his voice quiet. But I think the choice is already being made for me. Lyra's hand brushed his arm gently, grounding him in the present. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. You're not alone in this. Jacob nodded, though the weight of the decision hung heavily over him. The catalyst had chosen him, but now it seemed the consequences of that choice were far more complicated than he had imagined. His mind raced with the possibilities. What was the catalyst really? What was the darkness the guardian had spoken of? And most importantly, what was the fate of the worlds the figure had mentioned? Before he could voice his thoughts, Owen spoke up, his voice filled with urgency. We need to keep moving. Whatever you're dealing with, it's not going to wait for us to figure it out. We need to find a way to understand the catalyst, before it's too late. Jacob looked at his friends, Lyra, Owen, and Ella. He knew they were right. There was no time to waste. The catalyst had already begun to change him, to pull him into something far bigger than himself, and he couldn't afford to let it control him. He had to understand it. He had to learn what the Guardian had meant by the key and the choice, and he needed to figure out where this path would ultimately lead. We'll head to the next city, Jacob said, his voice firm. We can research the catalyst, learn everything we can. We'll find answers, and we'll stop whatever's coming. The group nodded in agreement, and without another word, they started their journey once again. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the land, but Jacob didn't mind. He felt a determination rising within him that was stronger than any fear he had ever known. As they walked, Jacob's mind returned to the figure, the Guardian. The question lingered. What did it mean to be the key? And what was the darkness he had warned about? But no matter how many questions he asked, there were no answers yet. Only the road ahead, leading them toward unknown dangers. But Jacob was ready. Whatever came next, he would face it head on. He had no choice but to. And whatever choice was ahead, he would make it his own. Chapter 22. The City of Shadows. The journey toward the next city was uneventful, but Jacob could feel the weight of the road pressing down on him. Every step felt like it carried more significance than it should. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for him to make a move, make a choice. It had been 2 days since he'd returned from the strange world through the archway, but the tension in the air never left. Lyra, Owen, and Ella were with him, but even their presence couldn't shake the feeling of being on the edge of something far greater. As they crested a hill, Jacob saw it in the distance, the city. Its silhouette loomed dark against the setting sun, a jagged collection of towers and spires, some broken and others towering higher than they had any right to be. The architecture was a mix of ancient stone and modern metal, but there was something wrong about it. The city didn't gleam in the sunlight. It seemed to absorb it, casting everything around it in shadow. That's our destination? Owen asked, his voice full of disbelief. Doesn't look like much of a welcoming place, Ella added, squinting at the dark horizon. Jacob felt the uneasy pull of the catalyst again, tugging him toward the city, as if it knew the answers to his questions were hidden somewhere within. This is it, Jacob said quietly. We need to go there. Whatever answers we're looking for, they're there. The path toward the city was long, and as they approached, the buildings began to crowd closer, creating narrow alleyways that seemed to pulse with an energy that Jacob could feel in his bones. The city was alive, but not in the way a city should be. It was a city of secrets, a city of shadows. By the time they reached the city gates, the night had fallen, and the streets were eerily quiet. The city was still, save for a few flickering street lamps casting long, distorted shadows across the cobblestone streets. Are we sure about this? Lyra asked, her voice tense. Jacob glanced around, feeling the weight of the decision in his chest. We don't have much of a choice. If the catalyst led me here, then we have to find out why. They walked through the city, passing by empty shops and buildings that seemed to have been abandoned for years. But then, they came to a square where a small group of people gathered around a central fountain, their faces obscured by hoods and scarves. The air around them felt charged, and Jacob could feel the catalyst vibrating with a strange intensity. Stay close, Jacob murmured, motioning for his friends to follow. They moved through the crowd carefully, trying not to draw attention to themselves, but the people in the square seemed to notice them anyway. Their eyes flicked toward Jacob with a strange intensity. It was as if they could sense something in him, something different. Jacob, Lyra whispered, pulling at his sleeve. Do you feel that? Jacob nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. Yeah, something's not right. Before they could react, a voice called out from the center of the square, cutting through the tension like a blade. Jacob Torres, the voice said, smooth and unsettling. You've come. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He turned to face the voice, but there was no one there. The crowd had parted, and standing in the middle of the square, illuminated by the faint glow of the fountain's water, was a figure cloaked in black. The figure's face was hidden in shadow, but Jacob could feel the weight of its gaze. "Who are you?" Jacob demanded, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. The figure stepped forward, the cloak swirling around its feet like smoke. "I am the one who has been waiting for you. The one who has seen what you've become and what you will be." Jacob took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean, what I'll be?" The figure's lips curled into a smile that never reached its eyes. "The Catalyst has chosen you, Jacob Torres. You have come this far, but do you truly understand what it means to wield such power? Do you know the cost?" Jacob's mind raced. "What's the cost? What do you want from me?" "I want nothing from you, Jacob. I am simply here to offer you the truth." The figure raised a hand, and the air around them grew heavy, thick with the weight of ancient knowledge. The Catalyst is not merely a power. It is a force, a piece of something much larger than you can imagine. A force that can both create and destroy. And you, Jacob Torres, are the key. "Stop calling me that." Jacob's voice broke through the figure's words. "You keep saying I'm the key, but what does that even mean? What am I supposed to do with this power?" The figure's smile deepened. "The choice is not yours alone, Jacob. The Catalyst's path is already set in motion. It is up to you whether you become its master or its victim." Jacob clenched his fists, feeling the Catalyst stirring within him. "I won't be anyone's victim. What do I need to do?" The figure's gaze softened, almost pitying. "You will have to face the darkness, Jacob. The one that has been waiting. The one that will test you in ways you cannot imagine." With that, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing from sight as quickly as it had appeared. The crowd around the fountain seemed to disperse just as quickly, vanishing into the dark alleys and streets as if they had never been there. Jacob stood there, his breath coming fast. The weight of the figure's words lingered in the air, thick with menace. The darkness was coming, and he would have to face it. But where was the light? What was the choice that awaited him? His friends stood behind him, silent and uncertain. They didn't need to say anything. Jacob knew they were ready to face whatever came next. They had come this far together, and they would face whatever the Catalyst had in store for them. But as Jacob looked up at the darkened skyline, he couldn't shake the feeling that the true challenge was only just beginning. Chapter 23, The Catalyst Unleashed. The city was quiet again, but the tension in the air had only thickened. Jacob stood at the edge of the square, his eyes fixed on the darkened alleyways where the mysterious figure had disappeared. The words it had spoken echoed in his mind. "The choice is not yours alone. The Catalyst's path is already set in motion." His heart raced, as though his pulse was in sync with the strange energy thrumming inside him. The Catalyst, whatever it was, had a power he barely understood, but it was clear that this journey was no longer just about him. It was about something much larger, something that could change the fate of everything. "We can't just stand here," Lyra said, breaking the silence. "We need to figure out what the figure meant by the darkness. And what we're supposed to do next." Ella nodded, her face serious. "It's not just the Catalyst, Jacob. It's everything. That figure, what if it was telling you that you're supposed to stop something, or even someone?" Owen glanced around, looking warier than usual. "Whatever we do, we can't trust this city. There's something off about it. We should find a place to lay low, figure things out without drawing attention." Jacob nodded absently, lost in thought. His friends were right. The city, with its ominous architecture and strange inhabitants, was far from safe. The figure's words still clung to him like a shadow. Face the darkness. But what did that mean? Who or what was this darkness? And why had it all come to him? "We'll keep moving," Jacob said finally, his voice firm, though the uncertainty in his chest remained. "We'll find answers. We need to understand what the Catalyst is, and why it chose me." The group made their way deeper into the city, passing through narrow, winding streets and alleys where the shadows seemed to grow heavier with every step. The distant hum of activity from the city center was muffled here, replaced by a thick, almost oppressive silence. As they reached the base of a crumbling tower at the heart of the city, Jacob felt a sudden pull. It was the Catalyst again, a sharp, buzzing sensation that seemed to reverberate from deep within him. He hesitated, glancing at Lyra and the others. "This is it," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. I can feel it. We're close. Close to what? Owen asked, but he followed Jacob without question, his grip tightening on the hilt of his sword. They moved cautiously toward the entrance to the tower, a large stone archway flanked by crumbling statues that seemed to watch them with hollow eyes. The door was slightly ajar, and Jacob pushed it open with a creak. The moment he stepped inside, the air shifted, cold and electric, thick with something unnatural. Inside, the tower was massive, its walls lined with ancient runes and flickering symbols that pulsed with an eerie, rhythmic light. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and atop it, something gleaming in the dim light. The catalyst. It sat on the pedestal like an artifact from another world, glowing faintly with a light that seemed to breathe, shifting and pulsating. Jacob felt the pull even stronger now, as if the catalyst was calling to him, inviting him to take it. Before he could reach for it, a voice echoed through the tower, low and commanding. You've come for it. Jacob turned to face the source of the voice. Standing in the shadows, just out of reach of the flickering lights, was another figure. Taller than the one in the square, this one was cloaked in darkness itself. The figure's eyes glowed with an unnatural fire, and its presence seemed to warp the space around it. I am the one who watches over the catalyst, the figure said, its voice like a storm. And you, Jacob Torres, are the one who will either save or destroy everything. Jacob's heart pounded. Who are you? I am the keeper of what's beyond the catalyst. The one who protects it from those who would misuse its power. The figure stepped forward, and the shadows seemed to move with it, swirling around its form like a living cloak. And I know why you've come. You believe you are the one who can wield it, the one who can control its power. Jacob stood tall, his pulse quickening. I don't know if I can control it, but I won't let it control me. The figure chuckled, a cold, harsh sound. You think you have a choice. The catalyst doesn't just grant power, it demands a price. And that price is far higher than you realize. Jacob's hands tightened into fists. He was tired of being told there was no choice. He was tired of being manipulated. What is the price? Jacob demanded, stepping forward. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, and Jacob could feel the air shift again, colder and heavier. The price is your soul. The price is your very being. If you wield the catalyst, you will change, become something else. And you will carry its burden for the rest of your life. Jacob's heart sank. He'd known there was a catch, but this was more than he had ever anticipated. His soul. He thought about the power, the choices that lay before him. Was he willing to sacrifice everything for it? I didn't ask for this, Jacob said, his voice strained. No one does, the figure replied, its voice growing louder. But now that you have chosen to step into the world of power, there is no turning back. You must choose. Will you take the catalyst and fulfill your destiny, or will you reject it and lose everything? Jacob felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a stone, suffocating him. He looked at Lyra, Owen, and Ella, their eyes full of concern but also determination. He had to make a choice. Not just for himself, but for them, for everyone. The fate of the world, of all the worlds, rested on his shoulders. Jacob, Lyra whispered, taking a step forward, we're with you. Whatever you choose, we'll face it together. Jacob closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The weight of the decision was crushing, but one thing was clear. He was no longer just a kid in high school. He was someone who had the power to change the world. The question was, what kind of world would he create? Jacob took one final step toward the catalyst, feeling its power surge through him as his hand reached out. And then everything went black. Chapter 24. The unraveling. Jacob's hand hovered just above the catalyst, his fingers trembling. The room around him felt as if it were holding its breath, waiting for his decision. Every part of him screamed to hesitate, to rethink the consequences of wielding such a power. But the pull was overwhelming. The catalyst hummed in response, almost as if it was calling out to him, urging him to make the choice. With one last glance at his friends, Lyra, Owen, and Ella, he closed his eyes and let his hand fall onto the surface of the catalyst. The moment his skin made contact, the world seemed to explode in a blinding flash of light. A wave of energy surged through him, more intense than anything he had ever felt before. It was as if every atom in his body was being pulled apart, twisted, and remade in an instant. His mind raced, visions flashing before his eyes, visions of distant worlds, of dark forces rising, of destruction and rebirth, all centered around the catalyst. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the light faded. Jacob opened his eyes, gasping for air. The tower around him seemed to blur, the walls flickering in and out of focus. He felt different. The energy inside him was like a wildfire, burning with untamed power, but it also felt alien, like it was no longer entirely his own. Jacob. Lyra's voice broke through the fog in his mind. Jacob, are you okay? He turned toward her, but his vision swam, and he couldn't quite focus. The energy inside him felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The catalyst's power surged within him, but it was more than that. It was as if it had taken root in his very soul, binding him to something much larger than himself. Jacob began, but his voice cracked, and he swallowed hard. He felt like he was drowning in the power coursing through him, unable to control it. I don't know if I can. Before he could finish, the tower seemed to tremble, the ground shaking beneath their feet. A deep, guttural sound echoed from deep within the structure, reverberating through the walls like a warning. A figure appeared at the far end of the chamber, stepping out from the shadows. It was the same figure who had spoken to him earlier, the one who had warned him of the catalyst's price. But now, there was something different about it. The figure was no longer just cloaked in darkness. It seemed to be the darkness, a living, breathing embodiment of everything Jacob had feared. You've taken the catalyst, the figure said, its voice a low, threatening whisper. Now you've unleashed it, and now, you will face the consequences. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to stand. The weight of the catalyst's power was suffocating, but he couldn't back down now. He had made his choice. We'll deal with it, Jacob said, trying to steady his voice, though his body betrayed him. The power inside him was writhing, fighting for control. We'll face it together. But the figure's smile widened, cruel and dark. You cannot fight what you have become, Jacob Torres. The catalyst is no longer something you can control. It is a force of nature. And now, it is your master. Suddenly, the ground beneath them cracked open, a massive chasm appearing where the pedestal once stood. From the depths of the chasm, a black, swirling void began to rise, its presence oppressive and malevolent. Jacob could feel the darkness pulling at him, threatening to consume him whole. Jacob, Owen shouted, grabbing his arm. We need to get out of here. This place is collapsing. But Jacob couldn't tear his eyes away from the void. It felt like it was calling to him, beckoning him into its endless abyss. The catalyst's power surged within him, and he could feel his connection to it deepen, its influence spreading through every fiber of his being. You've made your choice, the figure said, its voice like thunder. Now, you will face the storm. The chasm widened, the darkness spilling out like ink, devouring everything in its path. Jacob could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, heavier than ever before. He had chosen to wield the catalyst, but at what cost? Was he strong enough to control it, or would it consume him and everything he loved? Before he could respond, the ground beneath them shattered, and the tower began to collapse around them. The darkness surged forward, reaching out like a tidal wave. Run! Jacob shouted, grabbing his friends and pulling them toward the exit. But the energy from the catalyst was too much, and it threatened to tear them apart. As they sprinted through the crumbling halls, Jacob's thoughts raced. What was happening to him? What had he done? They reached the doorway just as the tower crumbled into the abyss, and the darkness threatened to swallow them whole. Jacob, desperate, reached out for his friends, pulling them into the light. The last thing Jacob saw before everything went black was the figure standing at the center of the storm, watching them with eyes that burned with ancient fury. To be continued. Thank you for listening into my second story. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you will always be aware of new videos I upload. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day.